All right, if you just do it, it turns out okay. And welcome to Season 8, Episode 9 of Talking Time with Caffeine. My guest has been on the show before during the after show debate, but reintroductions never hurts anybody, so reintroduce yourself to my guests.
Well, hello everybody. I am Dapper Dinosaur. I run a channel by that name. I do mostly, mostly like young Earth creationist takedown stuff, or responses. I also have some just strictly educational stuff. A video that I have coming up soon is a 3D tour of a T-Rex skeleton, going over the names of various bones and such, so you can, understand things like if you read a description of a fossil of a dinosaur or something, you'll have an easier time understanding what they mean by these things, by the terms they use. I also do a series called Things That Aren't Dinosaurs, where I take a look at animals that people think are dinosaurs, but that aren't. And I tell you why they're not a dinosaur, and what they are, and a little bit about the science behind them. I've done crocodilians, I've done plesiosaurs, pterosaurs, and coming up pretty soon, I'm going to be getting the script together for Dimetrodon. So, yeah.
That one is on the way other side of the family tree. At least the first three you had were closely related. That one's like way off in the branch. Yeah,
it's true. Dimetrodon is much closer to humans than it is to dinosaurs as far as the cladistics go.
Oh. Yeah, you haven't done that episode in a while.
Yeah.
And plus, you're also continuing... God. His name's drawing a blank now.
Leaving Young Earth Creationism?
Yeah, his series.
Yeah, so Bill Ludlow started a series called Leaving Young Earth Creationism, and it was just having people on who were former Young Earth Creationists to talk about their experience leaving Young Earth Creationism, how they got into it, how they got out, what the reasons were, talking about their feelings about Young Earth Creationism now that they were out, and all this stuff. And I was going to be a guest on it because I'm a former Young Earth Creationist, as I mean, your viewers may or may not know, but people who've watched me for a while would know. But very sadly, about a week or so before I was supposed to be scheduled to appear, Bill Ludlow passed away. And it was unexpected for everyone, I think, except his family. He kept it very close to the chest that he was ill. And so basically, on the day that I would have been there, I decided to have an interview about that anyway, where my friend Dead Kennedy in Space, Kevin, from the Dead Kennedy in Space channel, came on, and he interviewed me about my leaving Young Earth Creationism. And I asked for feedback. I wanted people to let me know, like my viewers and things, how they felt about me continuing on to interview other people about having left Young Earth Creationism. And I got a lot of support, and I got a lot of people saying, yeah, that's a valuable thing to do. And RJ Downard, who I think you've had RJ on your show, haven't you?
No, I have yet to have him on the show. I've had Jackson Wheat on his show a few times.
Okay.
I wouldn't mind having him, but I can't never get hold of him. Busy guy.
He is a busy guy, but he had been collecting data from Bill Ludlow's episodes, and so when he noticed that I was also doing the show, kind of to, like, I don't want to say to fill Bill's shoes because I don't think I could do that, but in this small way to kind of take over for Bill, he started taking data from that series too. And we just had I think I counted, it's the 7th episode, I think, was earlier this morning.
Yeah.
Or it might have been 6th or 8th. 7
or 6, depending on, if you count mine as in that series.
Okay, yeah, because you were leaving old Earth Creationism. Right. I do also have an off-topic channel. It's called Top Hats Off.
You're not very dapper. You're just a dinosaur.
Yeah, I take the top hat off. I leave the monocle on because otherwise, how am I going to see, right? But yeah, it's mostly stuff like I'll do gameplay stuff, or I've streamed some stuff where I did some language creation because I have a one of my interests is linguistics, but that doesn't come up much on my channel. Although actually it comes up a surprising amount when you're debunking creationists, because they like to get into like, well, if you read the Hebrew here, and it's like, well, no, you're wrong in many ways about the Hebrew too. So it does come up occasionally. But also in my chat today, there was some talk about maybe doing a Warhammer 40K theme stream on my other channel. So, you know, it's just, it's randomness, I guess, kind of like, you know, to some extent your channel, where it's just like, hey, whatever random stuff we got going.
Yeah, I respect people who can do 2 channels at once, because I cannot do that. I cannot keep track of what's on what sometimes.
Oh, well, I mean, my Top Hats Off channel is not well maintained. There's no upload schedule. There are no series that I feel like I have to finish or anything like that. It really is just whatever I want to put up on YouTube, but that I don't want to be on my main channel because it's not on topic. Yeah. So if you subscribe to Dapper Dinosaur, you're only getting the stuff that's on that topic. It's gonna be science and pseudoscience debunk stuff. I did homeopathy, so you know I'm not sticking to only young Earth creationism. It is my primary focus. But yeah, if you subscribe to the other one, it's going to be whatever random crap comes out of my streaming software.
I guess if you ever stream Spore or something, it could be like a double dose of it. It'd be science and gameplay.
Yeah, that could be. Although Spore's take on evolution is a little bit off. Well, it's strange because Spore actually is more like intelligent design than it is like evolution, because you can do things like you can swap out parts for completely different parts that don't have to have any basis in what parts you had before. And like anytime you go to upgrade your little creature, if we're talking the creature mode, you can completely start over from scratch with the parts that you have unlocked. And there doesn't have to be any correlation to what you were doing before. Now, when most people play the game, you know, they don't take the time to do that. And they do kind of keep a similar sort of body to what they had before. But yeah, Spore is a little... I feel like if you use it too much as an educational game, you can get the wrong idea about evolution. But that being said, it's a fun game. And I played a lot of it when I was in the Navy, so...
So I think you mentioned this when I was on your show, but what kind of dinosaur are you again?
I'm a Ceratosaurus. Yes, Ceratosaurus is it's the basalmost genus in Ceratosauroidea, or Ceratosauria. Sorry, Ceratosauria, which is a theropoda is kind of divided down the middle after you get through some of the very basal theropods. Like you get some very, very basal things, like if Herrerasaurus is a theropod, that one. Perhaps some forms like why can't I remember it? The thing they got wrong in Jurassic Park, it doesn't really spit. What is it called? The one that spits. Oh my goodness. Why can't I remember
the one that killed the fat guy?
Yeah.
The fat killer.
Dilophosaurus. Dilophosaurus might be basal to the split, but once you get into like Arcelophysis is probably basal to the split too. But once you get into like the mid-Jurassic and on, there's this big divide between theropods, between Tetanurine theropods and Ceratosaurus, or I can't talk, Ceratosaurs. Ceratosaurs include things like Ceratosaurus, the Abelisaurs like Majungasaurus, Thanos, Carnotaurus, and also, if I remember correctly, the Carcharodontosaurs, although don't quote me on that one because it's been a while since I looked into Carcharodontosaur systematics. But Tetanurines include most of the other theropods that you know about, like Tyrannosaurus and all the raptors, and you know, almost every theropod that you can name is probably a Tetanurine. And hey, we got Nestle20 in the chat.
Hey, Nestle. So, are you on the? You're on the side of closer to Tyrannosaurus where your arms are less functional, or your arms still?
So, well, it's actually an interesting thing about derived theropods is they become more and more head dominant and less forelimb dominant, with the exception of the the Maniraptoriforms.
The one
and so
the bird lineage, the bird lineage.
Yeah, so Maniraptoriforms are you. I don't remember the formal definition, but if you go with animals that are closer to birds than they are to Tyrannosaurus Rex, that you're basically at Maniraptoriforms. And so outside of that group, there's this tendency for a lot of theropods over time to reduce their forelimbs. Where Ceratosaurus is still at the point where forelimbs are pretty useful for clutching prey. So Ceratosaurus could do things like run up to an animal, grab onto it with its arms, grab onto either side, and then bring its jaws down for a bite. So it can still use them to restrain prey. It's not going to be, playing the violin or anything on these arms, but they're still very functional.
Yeah.
And then but when you get to ceratosaurs that are very advanced, like Carnotaurus, its arms, it's not even clear that it could move its arms at all. And yeah. No, go ahead.
So are you expert on dinos like Erica's on primates?
I would say that Erica knows more about primates than I do about dinosaurs. I am a interested layman. I do a lot of reading about the subject, and I've been sort of blessed with a good memory for trivia. So, that accounts for a lot of it. But I have not actually been to school for vertebrate paleontology or biology. So yeah. I would say, but yeah, overall, if you want someone who's actually an expert on her field, Erica is much more of an expert on her field than I am.
Sure.
And she might be nice and deny it, but she is.
The Nestle wants to come in. Yeah, I recently had Tony Reed coming in too, but he had to cancel last minute. Sometimes I like to have 3 people, 2 people. 2 people is fine sometimes, but sometimes, I don't know, is this me or sometimes you get a lot of dead air with 2 people sometimes.
I mean, it doesn't bother me.
Well, maybe eventually.
Yeah, you do. Your thing.
When I'm eventually, wow. But yeah. Oh, so like
go ahead.
So like I mentioned on your I asked him and you and him today. I don't think you answered or not, but since you became believe in evolution, not believe, I guess it's that word, believe it, but accepting evolution. Like, did you any weird cousins that you learned about?
For Ceratosaurus,
or anything really.
So some things that I think are surprising include the ones that you mentioned. Like you mentioned that humans and dinosaurs are more closely related to tuna than tuna are to sharks. That is definitely true. The split there is you have osteichthyes and you have I'm gonna screw this up, aren't I?
That's
chondrichthyes. Yeah,
osteichthyes. That's the bony fish, and
chondrichthyes is the
cartilage.
Right. So I'm waiting for some caffeine to kick in, so I'm a little bit fuzzy around the edges here today. I woke up pretty early and I did my stream, and then I crashed pretty hard right after my stream, and then I had to set an alarm to make sure that I was going to be here for this one. So forgive me, I'm going to have a few brain farts here and there. But so sharks are on the chondrichthyes side, and tetrapods are on the osteichthyes. And tetrapods are all the things with 4 limbs, or that are descended from things with 4 limbs. So your reptiles, mammals, amphibians, all the things that are basal to those, like temnospondylus and things like that. Those are all tetrapods. And so that's an interesting one. You also had mentioned that fungi are closer to animals than plants, and that's true. One of the big things that connect fungi to animals is that is the use of chitin. And chitin is the stuff that your fingernails are made of. And so the cell walls of fungal cells are actually made of chitin. So every fungal cell is surrounded by a sheath of essentially fingernail. And it's also interestingly one of the reasons why it's hard to overcook mushrooms. So one of the nice things about mushrooms is you can basically add them at the beginning of any recipe, and they're never really going to overcook unless you burn them. And so one of the reasons for that is that chitin doesn't break down until it gets very high temperature.
Uh,
And so mushrooms tend to hold on to a lot of that structural integrity that plants tend to lose when you overcook them.
so even though you're a meat eater, do you eat mushrooms?
Well, I've learned in my 150 million years or so to broaden my palate a little bit.
Yeah.
So,
Oh yeah. I never really been a fan of mushrooms except for in Mario.
well, I mean, mushrooms are a thing where it's situational. Not every meal is going to go well with mushrooms, but I'm a pretty big fan overall. Um, they're versatile and they add a nice, almost meaty texture to things. So, like, if you're trying to go with like a meatless meal, which, by the way, if you're a human, you probably shouldn't eat meat with every meal. I'm just going to go out and say that as my. I'm not a doctor. Do not, if you need medical advice, go consult your physician. However, I'm going to say probably don't need meat every time you eat. But if you like the texture that it adds, you can just add some sautéed mushrooms and say carrots and onions to like a bowl of rice.
Okay,
It'll be pretty good. Cooking with Dapper Dino.
that could be a segment for your Chop Off channel.
Top hats off, cooking with Dapper Dino. Yeah, I don't do too much live cooking. I don't think I've ever done live cooking. Although, actually, you can see my stove in one of my videos. If you watch carefully in one of the episodes of Big Bang and the Creationism, or Big Creationism and the Big Bang is what it's called, sorry. I filmed a pot of water boiling on my stove and then moving it off of the stove so that it would cool down. And I know it sounds like a weird thing to put in there, but it actually does fit in with the with what's being talked about in the video I'm responding to. So you can get a little insider view of my stove. You can see my electric range topped with its red hot glowing little burner. Well, they're not even burners. I don't even know what you call them when it's not a gas stove. Heating element, I guess. At Benthoven, every time I cook, it's live. Well, I wonder if that means he cooks live food. And of course, Benthoven is my co-host, who's in your chat for my Kent with Bent series, which is a
where you get drunk and listen to Benthoven.
Yup. So the interesting thing about that is that we started listening to Kent Hovind together, Bent and I, well before I ever started doing Kent with Bent, and it was mostly Kent Hovind debates that we were listening to. And yeah, we would just have fun.
That's when you decide I want to debate him too.
Well, that is actually part of it, yeah. But we would just have fun, like making fun of how bad the arguments he was giving were, and then, so that inspired my debate because suddenly Benthoven and one of my other friends who wouldn't watch it as often with us, but they were like, "Oh, so when are you going to debate Kent Hovind?" And at first it was just kind of like, "Haha, that would be fun." But then eventually it got to be a thing where like, no, maybe I should do this. And so one day I just called him. I called Ken Hovind. I was like, "Hey, you want to do a debate on whether or not birds are dinosaurs?" And yeah, and then we did that debate. And for a channel with essentially no views and no subscribers, it did pretty well. And it was sort of the catalyst that got the channel to actually be something with actual viewers and content and stuff, because I had made the channel a while before that and put up like 2 videos, and then I just hadn't done anything with it since then.
So in your debate, how I got just the other people who debate him too, how much of his talk was actually about birds or dinosaurs?
So in his initial, so he likes to do openers and then he likes to go second. In his opener, almost none of it touched on whether or not birds are dinosaurs. He went on about Charles Darwin's biography. He talked about abiogenesis. He talked about the Big Bang. And yeah, he went all over the place except to the topic of whether or not birds are dinosaurs. The closest he came during his opener to saying anything was just giving his common designer argument. But by framing the debate as are birds dinosaurs, I explicitly, even in my opener, said, I'm not here to talk about whether or not birds evolved from other non-bird dinosaurs. Instead, I'm here to talk about whether or not birds meet the taxonomic definition for dinosaurs. And so, I talked about how, Kent agrees that humans are vertebrates. Why? Well, because they have the thing that you need to be a vertebrate, which is a backbone. You have, or well, vertebrae, which isn't one bone, but still, we called it a backbone. And so, well, what are the things that you need to have in order to be classified as a dinosaur? Well, there are these, and these, and birds have those, so birds are dinosaurs. And that he had no way to handle that because fundamentally, Kent Hovind doesn't know what a dinosaur is.
Yeah, the Gis Gallop thing. When Eric and Tony were on my channel, we renamed it as the Hovind Hustle.
Yeah, I've heard a few people use that. That was you, huh? Okay. I like that. And, I was going to say no disrespect to the late Dwayne Gish, but some disrespect to the late Dwayne Gish. But, yeah, Hovind has been using that, oh my goodness, for a while now. And he's slippery. I don't know if you ever saw the Professor Dave Explains debate or any of the videos that Professor Dave made after that.
Yeah, I think I saw some of it. I was like, I mentioned this in your thing. I was like, was we could have some time channels in some of these debates so I can skip the Ken Hovind part. I probably heard it over every time he debates.
So one thing I will do sometimes if I want to see his debate with someone else is like I came to the Conspiracy Cats debate late because I was busy or something and I tuned in and it was about halfway through. And so I just, whenever Conspiracy Cats was on, I would play it at normal speed. I went back to the beginning. And then every time Kent was on, I would just rush it to ×2. Because not only does Kent speak slowly enough that I can understand him on ×2, it means I get to skip through all of his very, very repetitious spiel.
I think you mentioned it when you're doing your series on the Big Bang series. I kind of kept thinking, okay, question for you. Did Kent mention the Big Bang in his debate about dinosaurs more than the Big Bang people actually mentioned the Big Bang and their
I wouldn't say it was quite that bad. I don't actually remember, if I'm being honest, exactly how much he talked about things like the Big Bang, but if I remembering correctly, he did go into his, the six different definitions of evolution that no one calls evolution except for him. But yeah, he certainly spent more time off of topic than on topic, at least in the first half of the debate. Once he realized that I wasn't letting him get out of this and I wasn't going to be baited into talking about the Big Bang or abiogenesis and that I really was going to be talking about taxonomy, he was sort of trapped into going into taxonomy and showing how little he knows about either taxonomy or dinosaurs in particular, despite calling himself Dr. Dino and running I guess it's like a cross between a campground, a theme park, and a cult compound called Dinosaur Adventureland. I don't know exactly what you'd call that. It's a weird.
Does he have two of those now? Like one in Florida and one in his new thing? Or?
So the one in Florida was seized by, I believe, the state of Florida, or it might have been the IRS. I know some government group seized it. And also, I believe they destroyed most of the buildings and quote unquote rides because they were not up to the local building code.
Building code? Who needs that?
Yeah. Well, if you don't want your buildings destroyed by the government, you do.
He could afford it. He wasn't paying taxes.
Well, that's true. He was not paying. He wasn't. He bragged for a while, like, "Oh, I haven't filed income taxes in 20 years." It's like, well, I mean, it's risky, but
doesn't that compare him to the God, name my brain's going dead right now. Oh, Al Capone.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about Al Capone is despite the fact that he was obviously a liquor runner and a gun runner and he'd ordered numerous hits and whatnot, the one thing the government finally got him on was tax evasion, and that's why he ended up in jail. Now, of course, he didn't spend very much time in jail because he died of untreated syphilis not that much longer after. So, yeah, but it is a similar thing with Al Capone. Of all the things that he's done, the one thing that both Al Capone and Ken Hovind got caught on were tax evasions.
Yeah, that you ever watch the old Batman cartoons?
It's been a while, so I might not remember this, but
There's this one segment where Joker had money and he says, "Batman, police, no problem. IRS, no, thank you." He's like, Joker was like trying to pay his taxes. Like the IRS, I'm not keeping it to them.
Well, so one thing that I find funny is that it actually is in the IRS code that you owe money on any income that you've gotten from illegal means. So I always wonder, like, do they actually expect like drug dealers or hitmen to be like, well, I got paid this much for assassinating someone or selling little kids heroin or something? I'm always curious as to what the people writing the law actually picture.
You're like,
but
how'd you make this money? I earned it.
Yeah.
Okay. Go on.
Don't worry.
We got our cut.
And Vandal, so this is from Nestle. Yeah, Kent thinks that dinosaurs are just big, scaly lizards, hence the name, not knowing that even crocodiles are called Yeah, it's Kent's argument that dinosaurs are lizards, which he seems to legitimately believe that dinosaurs fall within like the taxonomic category of lizard.
Yeah, I think it's because I think it goes back to the naming thing, you know.
Yeah,
they named it terrible lizard, so it must be a lizard.
Yeah, essentially that's his argument, is that it's etymology. It's like, well, the name means terrible lizard. It's like I know what the name means.
People that know that people named it back in the 1800s. They didn't know very much that we do now.
Well, actually, even when it was coined, so Sir Richard Owen is the one who coined the term Dinosauria, and he knew. Richard Owen was a gigantic jerk, and he was a creationist, and in fact, he committed academic fraud in order to push creationism on several occasions. However, he was not enough of an idiot to think that dinosaurs were actual lizards. But he was stuck with trying to use Greek and Latin because that was the standard for naming, taxa. And I mean, Greek only had words for animals that they knew about in, the antiquity. They didn't know about dinosaurs in antiquity. At least they didn't give them any particular name. So, yeah. And yeah, the Jackson chameleon is a dinosaur if you give it a few hundred years. So it's funny because I've actually been thinking about doing an anatomy comparison between a Jackson chameleon and a Triceratops scale to be about the same size. Because the line that Hovind uses is that the Jackson chameleon is a mini Triceratops, and he bases this on the fact that the Jackson chameleon has 3 horns.
And because humans live for hundreds of years, like everything else.
Yeah. So according to the Bible, Adam and Eve lived to be 900 or whatever, and so obviously, if a Jackson chameleon lived to be 900, and it's like, no, that's not how that works at all. And so you can just look at the skeleton of both animals, and they are vastly different. The only way that you could confuse a lizard with a dinosaur is if you don't know anything about the anatomy of either. And it's just blindingly obvious. You can look at just their limbs, their pelvic girdle. You can look at their pectoral girdle. You can look at their ribs. You can look at their skull. You can look at their teeth. I mean, every single aspect about these animals is significantly different.
Yeah, I mentioned this. Speaking of taxonomy, I mentioned this when I was on with Bill. How it was in this too on your series, one of your series, but how, at least for school books aren't always up to date with the latest. School books aren't always up to date with the latest, scientific findings.
No, they're not.
And like when I was in school in the 90s, they still talked about the five kingdoms. It was like malaria, protists, fungus, plants, and animals. Because now we know there's like the domains now. They were, even though the domains had been found 20 years earlier, it wasn't updated yet in textbooks.
Yeah. When I was getting into high school, domains were just filtering into textbooks. And you could see sort of the beginnings of domain type thinking in earlier stuff. But now, I mean, at this point, scientists have largely given up trying to rank taxa the way that Linnaeus did. So you're like, oh, what's a kingdom? What's a phylum? What's a class? Where do we put these things? And now the answer is they're all just clades. As long as we know that it's a clade, it doesn't matter where it fits in this ranking.
Yeah, another thing I'm going to like the two that like the vertebrate classes back when I was in school. Two of them are out. Two of them aren't even exist anymore. The fish and reptiles. You know, they had fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, and mammals. But now the reptiles in the fish area are just totally pretty much useless now.
Yeah. Well, back when the Linnaean taxonomy system was still sort of it was still sort of officially in force, there wasn't this strong insistence on monophyly in named taxa. So a taxa could be paraphyletic. It usually couldn't be polyphyletic, but it could be paraphyletic. So a paraphyletic taxon is like the old version of fish, right? So it includes sharks and it includes tuna, but it doesn't include snakes or humans or turtles or anything like that. That's paraphyletic because the common ancestor of a shark and a tuna is the same as the common ancestor of a shark and a chimpanzee, right?
Kind of like how last week I mentioned with Erica, new world and old world monkeys are monkeys, but we're not monkeys.
Right. That would also mean that monkey would become paraphyletic because it excludes some of the descendants of the common ancestor. So under Linnaean taxonomy, paraphyly was broadly tolerated. Polyphyly wasn't. When people discovered that taxa at the time were polyphyletic, which means that it would include animals that weren't actually terribly closely related. So like if your taxa were like salamanders and lizards, because they both have sprawling limbs and they kind of have that wavy sort of walk to them, that wouldn't be allowed under Linnaean taxonomy. But paraphyly was. But now where the phylocode, which still hasn't really been finished, but it's finished enough to use, the phylocode is the new standard that biologists have really adopted. And under the phylocode, a taxon has to be monophyletic to be valid, which means fish isn't a valid taxon. It means reptile. If it's a valid taxon, then it has to include birds. So either birds or reptiles aren't a thing.
Yeah, well, I guess it is. I guess it's only valid if you only going for ray fin fish as its own taxon.
Well, one of the things is that we already have names for all these clades, and
that's like
really none of them are fish. So fish is not a word that really gets used in biology anymore.
I forget what that clade is called. I know we're the lobe fin side, but
that's Sarcopterygia.
Yeah, or it starts with an A, I think. I think it starts with an A.
So the ray fin fish are Actinopterygia.
Yeah, I knew it started with an A. Pronouncing's never been my thing.
Well, it's also not the easiest thing to remember. But so within Osteichthyes, the two main divisions you get are Actinopterygia and Sarcopterygia. Sarcopterygia includes things like lungfish, coelacanths, tetrapods. Those are basically the surviving groups of Sarcopterygians. And Actinopterygians includes all your things like tuna, salmon, trout. So
I guess that if you only ever had a fish clade, that would be the only pure fish clade would be the.
So you could call it Actinopterygia, but then most people still want to call lungfish and coelacanths fish. Sure. So what I would say is there's this other concept called an evolutionary grade. And this is a group of organisms that are grouped together because of similar traits that are basal. And that excludes later members. And it's not taken to be an actual clade. It's just it's a group. So for instance, sometimes you'll hear people talk about the mammal-like reptiles, and it doesn't include mammals. Well, they're not really reptiles, but you could think of that as a grade. There are things on the mammal side of the synapsid diapsid split. Well, it's actually the synapsid sauropsid split, but we can simplify it a little bit.
That's weird learning about that. You know, originally I thought it was the synapsid diapsid, but the diapsids are like buried deep within the sauropod.
Sauropsid.
Sauropsids, yeah.
Yeah. So sauropsid is a slightly wider group. Most of the sauropsids that you've heard of are in fact diapsids, but there are some animals that are anapsid within that. And when I say this, I mean in terms of their actual skull morphology. Like you have some anapsid grade sauropsids. You have You even have some animals that are outside of this split. Like there are some animals with what's called a euryapsid skull that are in like different categories, and the euryapsid condition has evolved convergently in a few different places, so it's a bit weird there. But yeah, there are more things on the reptile side than just diapsid, and for a while there was some question as to whether or not turtles were diapsids.
Yeah, or if they were anapsids or diapsids.
Yeah, and so recent genetic studies as well as paleontology has put turtles pretty firmly in the diapsid side. We've discovered things that are clearly related to turtles, but that actually do have a diapsid skull. And so it's not clear which temporal fenestrae closed first in turtles, or whether they both closed more or less simultaneously. We don't have great transitional forms for the changes in skull morphology. We have some pretty decent ones for the development of the plastron and the carapace, which the plastron is the bottom shell and the carapace is the top shell. So we do have some good transitional forms there, but the skull morphology it's a bit hard to track. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is just that, I mean, a plastron and a carapace is sort of easy to fossilize, whereas a skull is less so.
Yeah, like we're synapses, but we don't have that visible, at least that very visible hole in our skull anymore either.
So one thing you can do is if you put your forefinger on your temple, and then your thumb on towards the back of your jaw, and if you clench your jaws a little bit, you'll see there's this muscle that goes from your temple all the way down to your jaw, and that's your masseter muscle, and that's the muscle that passes through the synapse in a synapsid. And in fact, that arch of bone, that the synaptic arch or whatever, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head because my human anatomy isn't as good as my everything else anatomy. But that's actually the remains of a jaw synapse. And so that's that structure on you. In mammals, it's been kind of modified to no longer be a hole through the middle of the skull. And one of the reasons for that is that more primitive, or I should say basal, synapsids had a medial attachment for the jaw muscles. So their muscles pass through the skull to the inside of the jaw on either side. And mammals, as they moved their angular and syrangular bones back into the ear, the attachment site flipped over to the lateral side of the jaw. And so that's one of the reasons why, rather than going through the middle of the skull, it now has to go around the outside. And hey, what's up, Eric?
Yeah, I've been watching. Yeah, I've been watching Aaron Ra's series. The
systematic classification of life, I think, is that what it's called?
And I've learned that there are a lot more lines between synapses and mammals than I originally thought there were.
Oh yeah. Mammals are buried deep within synapsid.
Because I knew about the synapsids, the thorapsids, and the cyodonts, but there's like so many more.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the reasons why it's getting to the point where people then have to say, hey, why are we ranking these clades? Like, why is this taxon being assigned a class or an order or a family? Because there's no way to rank them. Like, is Thorapsida a bigger or a smaller clade than Diapsida? I don't know. How could you tell?
Just one thing I did notice. I think I can another show. I compared it to before I knew about all this. I compared them to like geometry. Where, you know how like a square is rectangle, not all rectangles are squares.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, well, all mammals are synapses, but not all synapses are mammals.
Right. In fact, really, it's hard to say. Well, first, one of the things you have to worry about when you're trying to say like which synapsids are mammals is, what do you mean by mammal? So one of the problems we have is that some of the traits that we use to identify mammals don't preserve well. So for instance, we basically have no preserved evidence about when milk production started. We can just infer it from jaw structures because we can see juvenile.
From what we know, the mammals we have alive today, like the monotremes, the marsupials, and the placentas.
Right. So it's a little bit tricky, and so one of the things that a lot of people have defaulted to is it's a mammal if it's a crown mammal. And so that gets into the question, well, what's a crown group? So a crown group is the ancestors of the extant members of a group and all of its descendants. So if you shared the common ancestor between all extant mammals, and you could say between, say, humans and the platypus, right? Yeah. Their common ancestor is the crown group ancestor for Mammalia. So anything descended from that is a crown mammal. And so I think most paleontologists have sort of defaulted to crown mammal as their definition for mammal. And everything else is like a mammaliform or a mammalomorph or something like that. And so you get to these, but even then it's a little bit complicated because you get to like, okay, well, what about, say, a multituberculate? We have some evidence that they had very, very specifically mammalian traits like ear pinnae, which aren't even in monotremes. So are they crown mammals? If so, where do they fall? Are they closer to the placental mammals? Are they closer to the monotremes? And it's not really clear in some of these cases.
Speaking of monotremes, you're going to hear something like kind of funny about my past before I learn more about cladistics and stuff. I originally thought that we were more closely related to birds, because of the tactile platypus. I thought when I was younger, that we came. Our common ancestor, duck-billed platypus, they're like a bird. They lay eggs, so we must be related to birds. We're bred in this.
Well, I mean, we are related to. Well, humans are related to birds in that they're both amniotes.
But more, but that's a little bit more distant related than I originally thought.
Also, Nestle 20 says that he saw a recent article that puts Varanopids and parareptiles within Diapsida. I would be very interested to see what evidence was given that Varanopids are diapsids, because that is not something I would have predicted. But I mean, I'm willing to be convinced. It would be a very interesting. Do you know about Varanopids?
No.
So they look superficially. They resemble verandid lizards, like monitors, like a water monitor or a Komodo dragon or something like that. But when you look at their morphology, they are definitely not verandid lizards. So I would be interested. It's not a group that I know a huge amount about, but I would be very interested to see that. So you should tweet that at me or something.
Oh yeah. So if you speaking of I'm waiting to buy Jackson's book when it comes out next. When I get my paycheck again, you going to get it, or you already got it?
I haven't quite gotten it. I'm thinking about getting the Kindle edition because it's significantly cheaper.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a Kindle account. I only have a.
You can get a desktop app. As far as I know, it's free.
Okay, I can try that. Let's do that. Yeah, I do have a Barnes and Noble version for Nook, but unfortunately it's not on Nook yet. So
yeah. Phylogeny of early amniotes and affinities of parareptile and Varanopidae. Varanopid from the Carboniferous Nova Scotia reveals evidence of parental care in amniotes. I actually wouldn't be surprised if there was some parental care in Varanopids. One of the things about being an amniote is that amniotic eggs take a lot more resources to produce, and so it pushes amniotes much closer towards R selection than K selection. Because if you look at like amphibian grade animals that can just put out a few thousand eggs into the water, fertilize them, stick them to some plants, and then leave, those end up using a lot less resources. But when you have to start doing things like putting in a yolk, or in the case of a lot of animals, putting in an eggshell and all of this stuff, that becomes resource intensive for each egg. And it's why, as a rule, amniotes show much more parental care than most, say, list amphibians or fish.
Oh, I mentioned earlier. It was good time. It was good timing too, since you're on the show today. Like, did you and you even mentioned this on your show, on your channel, on your thing today, but how they found the possible remains of the fossilized possible DNA in the hadrosaur.
So it was a hadrosaur, if I remember correctly. I know it was an ornithopod. I believe it was a hadrosaur. And there are these preserved cells that you can see under a microscope. And when they applied, so when you're looking at, and Benthoven knows even more about this than I do, but when you want to look at cells under a microscope, you usually have to apply certain chemicals to them to stain them, and different stains will bind to different chemical signatures in a cell. And so when they applied some stains to these fossilized cells that are used to bind to DNA, they bound to the sort of dark central region of these cells, which is what looks like a nucleus. And so that is preliminary indication that there may have been DNA in there. However, I mean, it's still not clear that it's DNA. Having a stain bind to something on the cell isn't proof positive of DNA. It's a very good indicator. So I am going to be, I think, appropriately cautious before I go announce that we just found dinosaur DNA.
Yeah.
Oh, and the chicken source? You want me to go into chicken source?
But yeah, that's too. Oh yeah, and it's probably. I think they said it was like built upon the already studies that the Mary made earlier, 10 years earlier.
Yeah, well, if Mary Schweitzer hadn't found osteocytes, things that are consistent with red blood cells, or whether or not they are, is still a bit up in the air, and collagen fibers, basically. If she hadn't found any of that, I doubt anyone would have even looked for cells in this preserved hadrosaur bone.
But I guess that goes to what we mentioned last week on either no, not last week. It was with last year with Jackson and Tony, where different scientific knowledge built up on each other. Yeah,
it's true. And I think that's actually a really good example of it, where Mary Schweitzer makes this rather astounding discovery, and at first even she doesn't believe it, right? So if you hear her talk about the process of making this discovery, she went to Jack Horner, who's her, at the time, I believe he was her boss. I don't know if she's still working for him, but he was her boss and sort of her mentor. And she was like, this looks like collagen and osteocytes, but that's impossible. He's like, all right, we'll prove it's impossible. And when she couldn't prove it was impossible, that's when she, started writing about that find. And then when other scientists, because initially the response is, well, that's impossible. You're wrong. This isn't osteocytes. This isn't collagen. But when other people had problems disproving that they were in fact osteocytes and collagen, then people started saying, well, hey, maybe we can find this type of material in other fossils. And so now we have this discovery, which now we're saying, well, maybe we can get scraps of DNA. And we're still a long way off from Jurassic Park, and I don't think we're ever going to get to Jurassic Park. But
yeah, I don't think that either. But it would be cool if we could TTwC, but actually map the genomes of the dinosaurs and stuff, so we can compare where they do land on the.
Yeah. Oh, and you'll find that unsurprisingly, their closest living relatives are birds, and that their next closest living relatives are crocodilians. Like, there's not going to be a shocker there. I guarantee it.
Well, I know that much, but I meant in the dinosaur family tree themselves, where.
Oh yeah, that'll actually probably be a little bit trickier, because it'll be pretty easy to establish the gross relationships between dinosaurs, modern birds, and modern crocodilians. But yeah. I am skeptical that we'll ever get enough to say resolve exactly how does the family tree of, say, Albertosaurine tyrannosaurs go? Yeah, I don't think that's ever going to be recoverable.
Because that's too bad. Because like we know, like mammals in our family tree, once we get some of it was like totally shooken up once we got the DNA thing, where we thought originally was one thing. We found out there was a totally different side of the family tree.
Yeah, that does happen sometimes with everything, really. Like it was for a long time, based on morphological studies, assumed that chiropterans, which are bats,
were some bats were closer to us, and they were the other bats.
Right. They were assumed to be a sister group to the archontans, which is primates plus colugos. So
and
yeah.
And then what was there? Oh yeah. Then there was the hippo whale connection.
Yeah, that was another one that was, I think, a little bit surprising. Although It has actually been known for a while that there are some skeletal links between Cetacea and Artiodactyla. And that's one of the reasons why some people are now using the word Cetartiodactyla. It's like a portmanteau of cetacean and artiodactyl. I don't like it. I just prefer to call them all artiodactyls, and cetacean is a subgroup of it. And I don't know that there's any official word on which word is the quote unquote correct. But I don't like Cetartiodactyla because it implies this division between cetaceans and artiodactyls, which is not taxonomically valid. Because like no one's gonna look at, say, giraffes and cows and pigs and be like, oh, they're set artiodactyl. We just call them all artiodactyls, but nested well within that is cetaceans. So I don't like this push to try to merge the two words, but I'm not in charge of any of that. So yeah. I do want to talk about the Chickensaurus though, because that's a fun topic. So do you know about the Chickensaurus?
I do not.
So is it Jack Horner? I think it's Jack Horner. Has this idea to use just a chicken genome, and essentially chickens have all of the genes to make all of the more basal dinosaur structures. Like they already make a 3-fingered hand. They have genes for teeth. You could fix their broken enamel gene to make them have actual real enamel on the teeth that they would grow. You can switch back on the genes that fail to switch on that would continue the tail on to become a long bony tail instead of having the short pygostyle. And so his idea is, what if we just make these relatively minor genetic tweaks to a chicken, and then we will get an animal with 3 separate fingers, all with claws, with teeth, with a dinosaur-like snout, and with a long bony tail. And essentially what you have at that point is just something that anyone would look at and be like, well, okay, well, that's essentially just a dinosaur. So I do think that it's probably very possible. There are, however, there's some ethical issues. So biomedical research has, and this would count into that to some degree, and genetic engineering research and stuff has some pretty strict ethical controls in most countries. And one of them is that generally speaking, you cannot take embryos that have been significantly tampered with and let them come to full term. So I don't know where he could get that done. And I haven't looked into the ethical issues enough myself to say whether or not I think it would be an ethical thing to do.
Yeah. Plus, we had to make sure if they did do that, then we had to make sure it was passed on the next generation too. Otherwise, it would be a one generation thing.
Well, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be heritable, because all of those would be changes to the DNA basically at the zygote level. At that point, any mutations at the zygote level are going to be germline mutations.
Well, I guess it would have to also be if those genetics, it would be if those traits were more dominant than recessive too.
Yeah, I have some good reason to think that they might end up being dominant, because most of it involves restoring a broken gene. And so people have a misconception about how gene dominance works. They'll think that, only the dominant gene gets expressed and the recessive gene doesn't, right? But that's not actually true.
I mean, it's sometimes it gets hidden in the thing.
Right. So it's actually the case that both dominant and recessive genes both get expressed. It's just that when there's a dominant gene, what that ends up meaning is that its expression becomes the thing that's more obvious in terms of the actual animal. So, for example, Gregor Mendel and his pea plants. He was the guy who kind of determined Mendelian genetics and whatnot. Yeah. So one of the genes that he identified was a wrinkled versus smooth gene for or alleles for pea plants. And so if you had a homozygous pea with 2 wrinkly pea genes or alleles, I keep mixing them up, but whatever, you get a wrinkly pea. And if you have one that's heterozygous for smooth and wrinkly, you get smooth. But the thing is that the difference here is actually that there is this particular protein that helps prevent desiccation in the pea. And the smooth allele produces a functional version of this protein, and the wrinkled allele produces a broken version. It doesn't retain water inside the pea. But when you're heterozygous, enough of the correct functional protein is made to make the pea smooth, but that pea plant will still make the non-functional version of the protein. And so the reason I think that many of these genes or these modifications would end up essentially being dominant is that in most cases, you're essentially switching back on a protein that essentially wasn't made or was made in a way that was defective in the bird. And so if you have half defective and half functional proteins, the functional proteins are going to do their function, and you're going to see the function. And so if that function is grow teeth, well, you're going to get teeth. So there actually is reason to suspect that the changes. Now, I'm not a geneticist. This is just my layperson sort of feeling about this. But I think there is actually good reason to think that if we made a Chickensaurus, that the Chickensaurus alleles would actually be a dominant.
Oh, cool. So yeah, we might actually. Of course, then we have to start feeding them maybe more meaty things than actually grain stuff because
Well, chickens actually eat a lot of meat already.
I did not know that.
Yep, chickens. They eat a lot of insects. They eat a lot of worms. They eat mice.
Oh,
they'll eat each other.
I did not know mice. I knew they eat maybe worms.
They'll eat baby chickens. They'll eat chicken chicks that aren't theirs. Yep.
Like some animals. Hey, you don't have my genes. Get out of here.
If they're hungry enough, they will kill and eat each other as adult chickens. So yeah, chickens actually do a lot more meat eating than people realize because, we see someone go in to feed the chickens. They always toss them grains. But if you toss some chicken scraps, like I know some farmers and all their kitchen scraps go to either a compost pile or the chickens.
Again, they're showing their therapsid lineage.
Oh, theropod?
Yeah. God
damn. Yeah. It's all right. Yeah. As TD Lane says, chickens are omnivores and they are terrifying. They are. They're vicious predators when they have a hankering for some meat. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why you get problems in your barn with rats and mice because there's, people put grain in there. But you don't tend to have problems with rats and mice in the chicken coop because the chickens will kill and eat them. So
again, going back to dinosaur ancestry, when we were little shrews and stuff, and dinosaurs ate us. So we remember. We're going back that way.
Well, to be fair, even in the Cretaceous, there were mammals or mammaliforms, depending on exactly how the shake 'em up comes out, that could eat smaller dinosaurs and certainly would eat dinosaur eggs.
Yeah.
So it's always been a little bit more complicated than just dinosaurs were big and ate mammals and mammals were small and had to run and hide. The Cretaceous had mammals the size of dogs.
Yeah, but I always joked one time that that's why we eat chicken and turkey now for
revenge.
Yeah, oh.
Yeah, and actually, I every once in a while when people ask about my favorite dinosaur, I go with turkey because it's delicious. And then people say, well, isn't that like cannibalism? It's like, I don't know. Is it cannibalism if you eat a cow? I mean, that's the kind of relationship we're talking about here in terms of relatedness. Like, yeah, it's like, is that really cannibalism? I mean, even being theropods, like if you look at the divergence time for different theropod clades, I mean, we're talking 150, 200 million years in some cases. You're not that far separated from a cow as a human.
Sure.
Your separation from a cow is 80 million years. You're more closely related to a cow than a Ceratosaurus is to a turkey.
Yeah. Nestle mentioned this back here a little bit, but yeah, about the dog and stuff. But I guess with the different selections, artificial, natural, and sexual, I guess with both those, sometimes the what was the recessive gene might become more pronounced because that's what it takes for either for survival or that's what we as humans want to breed out with them.
Well, so with the one of the big differences between artificial and natural selection is that in artificial selection, humans tend not to take into account every single possible detail whereas natural selection just does by nature. Anything that causes the animal to be selected against will end up being selected against. Whereas humans can say like, oh, look, this puppy is adorable. I don't care if it's going to get hip dysplasia as an adult. It's going to be the one that I breed with. Or these squished faced dogs are cute. I don't care that they can't breathe. We're just going to breed them. And so you can get these very strange and essentially deformed animals with selective breeding that are very unhealthy. But because humans are so good at keeping them alive and getting more of them, they just keep persisting and breeding. And that's where you get things where like show German shepherds basically can't walk anymore. Pugs can't breathe anymore. Huge amounts of larger dogs have big problems with hip dysplasia. And it's basically because humans, they can't keep all of the stuff that could affect the health of an animal in mind when they're doing selective breeding. Whereas natural selection just does it without trying. Because we can't try to do anything. It's not a person.
If you can like survive to have kids, and you're okay. You're okay.
Yeah. And Eric Virtaler, if you debate Kent on whether birds are dinosaurs, that would be great. I would love to watch that.
See if you've learned anything since your debate.
I guarantee you he hasn't. Yeah, he definitely hasn't. In fact, actually, I've been trying to get a debate with him, but he has been tightening the reins on who he will and won't debate and where he will and won't debate. And so I'm expecting him to not actually accept the debate with me and Erica, because Erica and I are trying to set up a debate with him where we both she and I debate him together. Originally, we wanted to debate Kent and Standing for Truth together. So they would be on one side, the two of us would be on the other side. But Kent Hovind seems to, one, not know who Standing for Truth is, and also, two, think that he's not a creationist. And so, like, he was just so baffled by the concept that I just dropped it. I was like, he doesn't even understand what I'm asking, basically.
You're like, means other creationists besides me? You're like, what?
Right, yeah. But I would also, I would really like to see what Eric said. And I think that the reasons that he's probably going to not end up debating me might not apply to Eric. So, yeah.
Plus, you should mention that he wants the docs. He wants like all your information for you too, like your address, your social security number, your faces.
I mean, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but he does want people's full names and their and actual photos. And I sent him my first name, which he already knows, and a picture of my avatar. And I said, you know what? This was the name and picture under which I debated Kent Hovind the first time. I think that would be perfectly sufficient for a subsequent engagement. So, and I do want to point out, I know that Nestle 20 had mentioned it, that it is also true that natural selection can do things that are not super great for the animal.
Can you so you want to send them the link? You can if you know how to get a hold of him.
Am I following him on? All right, let me copy the link and see if I can find him on Twitter.
Yeah. So I remember reading a book. I forget. I think it was one of the. I forget if it was Dawkins or Bill Nye, but I remember reading this article or chapter about these difference between natural and sexual selection, where they were breeding like guppies or something, and they put one set of guppies in a pond, in a river or pond with no predators. The other one they put with predators, and the ones without predators had more colorful spots for breeding. Breeding with the males had more colorful spots, so they could be seen, but sexual selection for the females.
Yeah, I remember that study.
But the ones with predators had more camouflage, so they could hide from the things. A little balance out between the two things.
Yeah, I just Nestle 20. I just sent you a DM on Twitter, so you should have the link at this point. Yeah, so check your Twitter DMs, and there you go.
Yeah, I think I saw a video about that. The best way to explain it was natural selection is the way to survive to the breeding age, and once you hit that time, then the sexual selection gets you to to breeding?
There is some truth to that. There really isn't much sexual selection up until breeding age, but it's also the case that natural selection isn't just a binary selection, right? It's not just, oh, you were selected against, so you didn't breed, or you were selected for, so you did breed. There's this concept called differential reproductive success. So if you have 20 kids and the other guy has 5 kids, well, you were more heavily selected for than the other guy. And so if your descendants keep having more kids, and we got Nestle 20 in. What's up, man?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, I can hear you too.
Great. Well, I have to first to say, like, I have followed you like for quite a while now, and I think I am one of your first subscribers because
I think so. Yeah.
I like the first video I saw was you explaining about why pterosaurs were not birds.
That's a really old one.
Yeah.
that was that like what, right after the debate?
I don't know. Like,
it might have even been before the debate. Yeah,
I think it was before the debate. Yes.
Wow. Yeah,
I learned from you that I didn't know that pterosaurs walked on their knuckles. I didn't know that.
Yeah, but they do it in sort of the opposite way, the way that apes do, because know apes curl their hands in, right, and so they walk. Depending which kind, they either walk on the first set of knuckles, like that are actually connected to the hand, or that next set up that are like the joint between the medial and proximal phalange. Whereas pterosaurs actually walk on the underside of their knuckles. So if you were to put your hand flat,
yeah,
kind of like you were trying to crack your knuckles against a desk or something. So where your hand is going to rest, that's the part of the anatomy that pterosaurs are walking on with their forelimbs.
That's really weird, yeah.
Yeah. Well, pterosaurs are they're bizarre. Yeah. Everything about a pterosaur is just weird. Their heads are weird. Their torsos are weird. Their spines are weird. Their feet are weird. Their hands are weird. It's like, if you want to see a freak show, just check out pterosaurs.
Yeah, it appears that like pterosaurs, like the body plan is so modified for flight. Like everything is so modified for flight that it actually appears that no pterosaur went flightless. Like there are lots of birds that went flightless over time independently, but pterosaurs apparently they never do that. Ever.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's never even been a hint of a flightless pterosaur.
Yeah.
Now, part of that could just be that there weren't too many instances where that niche wasn't already filled, with a niche that they might have taken had they become flightless. But it's actually very true that pterosaurs were much more highly modified for flight than even birds are.
Oh, yeah. Well, speaking of that, two things real fast. Off the topic, I was going to say, but like Eric said, most people found you because of the flat Earth thing or something.
Yeah. So I was on FTFE. Craig, who has a channel, I think most people here probably know about it. But one of the bigger breaks that I got in terms of subscriber count was that he did it's his series that he calls Stupid Humans, and I was his guest for the first episode. He usually has a collaborator on for it, and usually it's the collaborator who already produces content about that topic. And so his topic there was young Earth creationist stuff. So there was stuff like, did humans live with dinosaurs, and stuff about the flood. And so, I collaborated on that episode. It's pretty good. By the way, if you want to go check it out, like I think it's called "Stupid Human Thinks Dinosaurs Live with Humans" on FTFE's channel. It's a pretty fun episode. I liked it, and I think I got somewhere around 400 subscribers in the day and a half after that. And then there were a couple sub drives from Steve McRae. He helped me out a little bit there. And those two things together probably result in probably 600-ish, maybe more, of my subscribers.
Yeah. When I subscribed to your channel, you just had 4 videos.
Yeah, that probably sounds about right. Because I remember you coming in some of those really early ones.
Yeah, I might be the only one who probably, I'm not positive, but I might be, I'm the one that I found you via Eric. You came on my channel at the first after show. Like, he
right.
Can Deborah come on too? Like, okay, sure, why not? That's how I met you.
And that was a fun time. And by the way, to talk about some of the chat is Benthoven says, I found Dapper when he showed up on my aircraft carrier in the Navy. That is correct. I'm the first and last ever dinosaur that served on an aircraft carrier.
Well, unless you count aircraft carriers. Let's you count like pirates on pirate ships. That's not really aircraft carriers.
It's also not really the U.S. Navy either. As far as I know, that I don't remember the United States ever actually having chartered essentially pirates, because it was actually a common practice in the 18th century to have government sanctioned piracy. So you would give someone a charter to go, like if it was the British Navy, you'd give some guy with a ship a charter to go attack and sack, say, Spanish vessels. And as far as the British were concerned, it wasn't a crime for him to attack and steal from Spanish galleons. But as far as I know, the United States never did that. And even if they had, those people weren't technically parts of the regular Navy. So,
friends with benefits.
Yeah. But I don't think the United States ever did that. They weren't big into the... Like, look, I'm not going to be here and be like, oh, the United States is great and stuff. I'm not a big defender of many of the things the United States has done. However, I can say at the very least, I don't believe they ever condoned or chartered pirates. So
you're lucky. Like I am Dutch. I don't. I have like a bigger problem with that.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. There was a lot of the Germanic countries in general produced a lot of pirates for a long time, but it was not as big of a thing in really anywhere in England. There's not a huge history of English piracy until you get to the 18th century, and I don't really know why. The Anglo-Saxons came to England and they just kind of seemed to lose interest in doing all of the raiding and all that stuff in a lot of other places.
Like there's no one here to fight. Let's just settle down here.
Yeah, it's weird because I mean, if you look at like the culture of Anglo-Saxons, like if you read like Anglo-Saxon literature from the 8th century or something, it doesn't really read much differently than literature that you're getting out of other sort of at least nominally Christianized areas in Germanic-speaking countries. But there really is a big drop-off in their willingness to go out and just raid other countries to get stuff. And I don't know what it was. Maybe they just found England sufficiently farmable and with sufficient mineral wealth, they just didn't bother. I don't really know. It would be an interesting thing to have someone do a study on. I'm probably not going to do it, but
I guess like back when the Vikings were a thing, they were around for a while, then they just like chopped off on the raiding parts.
Well, I mean, the Vikings took over. They were doing a lot of raiding. In fact, actually, a lot of English. There's a surprising amount of English vocabulary and grammar that actually ends up coming from Old Norse and not from Anglo-Saxon. So, yeah. Like the pronoun they.
Yes, like for like I think for some of the early English kings before the Norman invasions were from Dane Vikings.
I don't know of any that were actually ancestrally Danish or Viking.
Well, Knut or something was. Knut for his name.
Oh, yeah, that might be the case. I don't.
Yeah, I used to study. I used to study English monarchy genealogy.
Well, and so like some interesting things is, and one of the things is that not all of the interaction between the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse were wars and raids. There were actually a fair few Norsemen who just settled down and became farmers in northern England, and we get from them certain words like the pronoun they, them. Yeah. That comes from Old Norse, not Old Anglo-Saxon.
And the ancestors of those farmers, they say, no, they will never reach Valhalla. They will never. No.
Well, sorry guys, but instead they just got to eat more regularly and not have to kill everyone.
Yeah.
But also the English word "are" for the plural form of the verb to be also comes from Old Norse, and so we get these weird little Norse influences in Old English. And interestingly, you know how German has this weird little bit where the third person singular feminine pronoun and the third and what is it the second person plural pronoun sound essentially the same?
Yeah, I learned German in high school, but I dropped it after I had the chance. So I'm not an expert on German language, even though I'm Dutch.
I believe it's those two that are the same pronoun. English had a similar problem where the third person feminine pronoun and the third person plural pronoun were identical in Anglo-Saxon. And it's thought that that's one of the reasons why Old English picked up the word they from Norse, is to stop the confusion between she and they. So yeah.
Well, speaking of languages, another thing about crazy this, and a lot of people compare the evolution of language like the evolution of animals into the tower. Like this is like the Tower of Babel. Everything was created in one day. Like the animals were created in one day. Language were created in a day. How language actually slowly evolved through the years.
Well, one of the things that makes, I think, it easier for people to believe the language thing is that we haven't been able to really well establish any connections between the biggest language families that we have. Like, no one can find a common ancestor between Indo-European and Semitic, or Afro, or even just Afro-Asiatic if we want to go bigger than Semitic. Like, what's the common ancestor for Proto-Indo-European and Afro-Asiatic? I don't know. Maybe there isn't one, or maybe there is, but it's just so long ago that we can't really recover that. So, but what it means, though, is that in order to believe in the Babel story, you have to believe that much sooner than a reasonable divergence time for a lot of these languages were just created whole cloth. Or you could say that, so if we assume that the Tower of Babel was like 3,000 years ago, or maybe 4,000 years ago. But the thing is, we already know that many languages from that time period are related to each other, and they're parts of modern families that we know about. Yeah. So did God just create a bunch of Semitic languages that look like they descended from Proto-Semitic, and then a bunch of Indo-European languages that look like they're all descended from Proto-Indo-European?
Well, like God created Tiktaalik, which conveniently looks like a fish tetrapod transition. So yeah.
I guess. He's just there he's just doing it to mess with you.
Yeah. To test your faith. To test your faith. Yeah.
Actually, that probably it might even go back to further back, to speciation. Sometimes it wasn't genetic. Sometimes speciation is just language barriers. A bird can from different tweet and not be able to breed with his other neighbor birds anymore. Yeah,
that is sometimes how speciation can start. Is just a difference in behavior. For instance, one interesting thing is, do you know what cicadas are?
The giant insects that come out every once so often.
Yeah, they make a racket, and all you can hear for the whole summer is just cicadas buzzing at you.
And they'll see it again for 18 years.
Right. Well, different populations of essentially genetically identical cicadas have different breeding cycles, because the breeding cycle of a cicada goes, okay, you have adult cicadas, they breed and then they die. And that's all an adult cicada does, is it finds a mate, it breeds, and it dies. And then the eggs that they lay hatch into little grub-like worms that then go attach themselves to tree roots and spend years just growing and feeding off of tree sap that they get from the roots. And then they metamorphose into adults. But each species has a certain number of years that it spends as a grub. But if you say have a 7-year cicada, what if you get two populations of cicadas that are both 7-year cicadas, but they come out on different sets of years? So they have a different 7-year cycle. Well, how are they going to breed together? They can't. And so if anything like that happens, you suddenly have two species that might be genetically essentially identical, but because they have a different breeding cycle, now they're never going to breed again. And you're going to get divergence in the genetics as mutations in both groups bring them farther and farther apart genetically over time. And so, yeah, even simple behaviors like when do you breed, or what sound do you make when you're trying to attract a mate, can cause these barriers to reproduction.
I've always also wondered, like speciation, like how much of our like evolution history in general it was our ring species, but that some of the rings are cut out. Rings are cut out.
Yeah, well, ring species is one of those. It's a great concept, although I don't.
It's like the ideal gas law. There is no ideal gas, but
right.
It's like it describes a thing that's useful. Like
right. Yeah,
more easily understandable than the actual thing.
Right, because one of the problems is that things that might become a ring species tend to get broken up before the ring can really complete itself.
Yeah.
So
I said so, like maybe gaps in the ring.
Yeah.
Too.
So there are examples of things that are almost ring species, but they don't technically quite meet the idealized definition. So have there ever been any real ring species according to the actual, like ideal situation? Probably not. But certainly things like that have happened. And sometimes you can get really simple things like, why are chimpanzees and bonobos different species? Basically because neither of them like to swim and a river started flowing between them.
Yeah, I made that joke. I made that joke last week of Erica, like because they don't like water, they don't like swimming. Then we're no chimps.
Yeah, it was basically like, oh man, I could mate with those other chimps over there, but I just don't want to swim there. So I'll just mate with the chimpanzees on this side of the river. And then suddenly, a few 100,000 years later, you have two different species of chimpanzee.
Well, one side we have Vikings, the other side we have hippies. No, kidding.
Not quite. The bonobos aren't as peaceful as people would like.
They are the women are the dominant.
Yeah, they do have a big change in that the female bonobos tend to be dominant over males, which is the opposite of what happens in chimpanzee groups.
Yeah, we mentioned that last week too. It would happen if a female bonobo met with a male chimpanzees, or they are both dominant ones.
It probably wouldn't work well.
Or the other way too. If a male bonobo met with a female chimpanzee, and they were both like the recessive or the passive ones.
Yeah, that would probably be a more peaceful encounter.
Yeah, like the troglodyte chimpanzees, they say like feminists. Like they will see it like them like no, what are they doing? Feel like a matriarchy. No,
I don't think it would be very ethical, but it would be interesting to see what would happen if you put some bonobos and chimpanzees in a shared enclosure and let them interact. Like what would actually happen? Because in some ways they're very similar, and in some other ways, especially behaviorally, they're very different. So I would be interested to see like how would they recognize each other and things, because both groups have been able to interact with humans in a socially meaningful way. But then again, humans are much more conflict avoidant than chimpanzees are. So I don't know. It would be an interesting
emphasis on more.
Well,
not entirely, but more.
Right. More conflict avoidant than chimpanzees. For instance, humans, when they get into a disagreement, tend to be unlikely to rip each other's testicles off.
Yeah.
Chimpanzees, on the other hand,
unlikely.
Right, unlikely. But humans are actually, for as violent as they are, which is considerably, when you compare them to chimpanzees,
those pesky laws we have,
right.
Yeah.
Humans still tend to be much more likely to seek out peaceful resolutions to conflicts than chimpanzees are.
We do it with sticks, not fists.
Well, I think that's actually one of the reasons why humans are more conflict avoidant, is because humans can fashion weapons that make them much more lethal than they otherwise would be. Whereas chimpanzees tend not to do that. They just tend to fist fight. And granted, they're stronger than humans are, but that's matched by the level of strength of the other animal. Whereas with humans, you don't know what that guy has as far as weapons go. And there might be one of his buddies hiding behind a hill with a javelin. You don't know. And so I think that really high risk for very serious injury or death with human-on-human conflict is one of the reasons why, in fact, when humans are set in areas where they don't have any particular laws to keep them in check, they don't end up just going out and killing each other. Like there have been examples where people are in situations where they don't have any pre-existing social structures that are already imposed on them. Like you get people who end up shipwrecked or something and they have to survive. And this is actual things have happened. They don't end up going every man for himself, kill the other guy before he kills you. Yeah. Humans tend to actually be much more peaceful and willing to negotiate than that. Yeah. And I do think that's one of the reasons is conflict between humans can be.
It's also interesting. Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No.
It's also interesting to see hunter-gatherer societies tend to be a lot more egalitarian than you might expect.
Yeah, they do. One of the reasons for that is humans are good at adapting to the need for division of labor, but when your technology is at a hunter-gatherer level, there isn't really that much labor that needs to be divided up for specialization. Where division of labor becomes really important is when you get to the point where no one person could effectively do all of the things that the tribe group needs.
And when we start settling down more and staying in one place.
Well, that's the kind of thing that things like farming and being able to settle down into a particular area, you can only do that at a certain level of technological sophistication.
And we're like, we don't need everyone to be a farmer. Like, you guys,
right.
It's one interesting, like I read something about this, like one of the interesting effects about transitioning to a how do you call it, from hunter-gatherer to a farming society, like agriculture. It creates a need for like something like marriage, because now you have like a one man owning a whole bunch of land, and I have all the food, and now I need to that creates like a family structure now,
right?
And also like more like a hierarchical society.
Yeah, back to the weapon things real fast too. I mean, like I said, with Erica's last week about how the Neanderthals they were more upfront, short range things, and we were like, oh, maybe if we throw from a distance, we won't get hurt as much.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, it's true. Humans are. I mean, it's not true that no other animals throw things, but nothing really has the precision or just accuracy of, oh, hey, the Daily Atheist.
Hello.
Humans are unmatched in their level to project force away from themselves at a considerable distance. Pretty much everything else, if you're not within striking distance, it's probably got nothing on you.
And I think it has to do with our waist. Like when you look at Neanderthals, they don't really have like a waist that we have, like a very thin.
They do have a much shorter waist. Their chest is much more barrel shaped, and it takes up a larger portion of their torso. But then again, I don't remember. I think there have been some spears of Neanderthals found, but overall they are much more robust than Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
And they were known to survive some pretty horrific injuries.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I wonder if the Neanderthals or even Homo erectus that we were descended from survived, if we would be like they would be on a community themselves, or we'd have them in a zoo or something.
Oh yeah.
I don't
know. I don't know.
Well, so one of the things, it makes it easier when there's as big of a gap in terms of cognitive function as there is between humans and almost every other animal. Like really only the great apes and maybe dolphins get close, and even then they're really not that close. I think that a Homo erectus would be much closer to a human cognitively than a human is to a chimpanzee.
Yeah.
And so I think humans. So you get like historically this distinction between brutes and people, and brutes are the animals that can't really talk or.
But we promise we can also be racist and stuff. So
Yeah.
Well, even then though, even at our most racist periods, we tended not. There aren't really too many instances where you can find someone who was literally having a human in a zoo. There are a few here and there, but it was very uncommon, even at the height of racism, at the height of the British Empire.
Yeah,
like there were a few instances of Aboriginal Australians that had been put in an exhibit. There were
of course, it's all the fault of Darwin and
right. Because no one was a racist until Darwin. There are also a few examples of people taking tribes folk and exhibiting them more in like a freak show environment than in a zoo,
or like the Roman Coliseums and stuff.
Yeah. But it really is pretty uncommon for there to be human zoos in human history. So I don't know. It's a weird question about if there had been an extant population of Homo erectus in historical times, what would Homo sapiens have done with them?
It's also interesting. Yeah, it's also interesting to know that that the humans that we those who are still left are like very close. Like we get all this thing about our human races, like black, white, and brown and such, but we are like one race actually.
Yeah, human genetic diversity is fairly low, and the gross morphological characters that humans use to divide each other into various racial categories are fairly minor from a genetic standpoint.
Yeah, and they are also continuous, like they form a clinal relationship instead of like the actual box division.
Right. It's easy to look and say, oh, there's a bunch of races. If say like let's say you show up in say I don't know like some European country, like okay, so you show up in England or France or Denmark or something, and you see okay, well here's like a Somali immigrant population. Well, yeah, obviously they look considerably different from the native population in the area. But if you were to walk from Somalia to, say, France and look at what the native population looked like in every single place you stopped in, it would be a gradual transition without any real break in what the people looked like. It's just when you take people from wildly different places in the world and stick them together that, yeah, you get to see these stark differences in phenotype. But if you were to walk between them, you wouldn't see these abrupt changes in phenotype.
I hate when I have a thought and I wait and then the time I get done talking.
I was sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I lost my thought now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
About human races or about like you were talking about
both maybe.
Chimpanzees.
Races. No, yeah, the different races and genetics. I think it was like 70,000 years ago. We had the Bottleneck event or something.
Yeah.
The Toba eruption, I think, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was somewhere around 70,000 years ago.
Yeah.
I like to think about how genetically similar we are because of that. To imagine if the flood was real, we had that genetic bottleneck.
And there were only 8 people. Yeah. Actually, that reminds me of one of my pet peeves with young Earth creationists because they're like, "Oh, look, Y chromosome Adam. That would be Adam, right?" It's like, no, that would be Noah.
Yeah, exactly.
The fact that you think it would be Adam means that you don't understand what Y chromosomal Adam is.
Yeah. Although I have to note, like the Toba genetic bottleneck theory is not really widely accepted. I think like there are some who propose it, but there are also like others who say it's not really substantiated. So maybe there may be a bottleneck, but there may not be, and it may be related to the Toba eruption, but may also not be.
Yeah, it's not super firm, but humans do have an unusually low. Like humans have less genetic diversity than chimpanzees do.
Yeah.
And it's not. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think that's more to do with like rapid migration from Africa. When you have rapid migration, then you carry less diversity from that point on.
That explains why non-African humans have less genetic diversity than African humans. Even when you add in all of the African humans to the non-Africans, you still don't get as much genetic diversity as you do in just pan troglodytes.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
And you said you mentioned that how with quote like with Noah being like with Adam, some people would say that his wife would be Eve, mitochondria Eve, but that would only be the case if their sons married their sister, married their full sisters.
Right. Yeah. That would all. Yeah. So the fact that young Earth creationists can't consistently get right the difference and who would actually be Y chromosomal Adam if their ideas are right just goes to show you that they just don't even know what Y chromosomal Adam is, and they really don't know what mitochondrial Eve means, and they also don't understand why evolution would predict that every species that has ever existed would have an analog. Now it's going to depend as far as Y chromosomal Adam as to whether or not you're using XY sex determination. So if you're using like VW sex determination, then you're going to have a different kind of setup. But at least all mammal species that we know of would have a Y chromosomal Adam and a mitochondrial Eve, and that wouldn't be.
Therian mammals. I think like monotremes have a different sex determination.
Oh, that might be. I'm not sure.
I made a joke once that the real mitochondrial Eve would be that first eukaryote that kidnapped the mitochondria DNA.
Well, that would be the case if you're. So the thing is, mitochondrial Eve is usually something that's defined for a particular species, but you can generalize the concept, or you can make the concept even smaller. So you could say, well, what's the quote unquote mitochondrial Eve for all people of European descent? You could just sample all of them and see, okay, well, what's the haplogroup they all fall into? And you could get a smaller group than that, or something like that.
And
But you
also,
could also-
it may be very difficult because then you have to define who is descendant from Europeans. Like, how do you
Yeah, because there's always going to be some amount of
areas. Yeah.
But mitochondria, female line is it's a bigger group, or it goes back further than the Y chromosome group.
Right. Well, I gave an example, I think, in one of my videos, and I was like, well, suppose that everyone, let's say that Elon Musk gets his way and humans colonize Mars, and it just so happens that all of the women who end up colonizing Mars all fall into a particular haplogroup as for mitochondrial DNA.
Yeah.
Now, the woman who originated that haplogroup would become their mitochondrial Eve, and if we assume that there isn't going to be interbreeding between Earth and Mars after this point, maybe there's some disaster that happens. It doesn't matter, and they speciate into another species. That species is going to have a different mitochondrial Eve than the rest of humanity.
Yes.
And so this mitochondrial Eve isn't some first human woman that existed and was created de novo. She would have had other women who lived with her. She would have been a part of a population that included females. There was a whole breeding population. It's just that she is the last, or the most recent, I guess, female line ancestor for all humans who you can trace.
Sexual selection.
Well, it doesn't even have to be sexual selection. All that it means is if you take every single female human today, right now, and you trace back to their mothers and their grandmothers and you always go back and you never cross over to the male line. So you always get the female ancestor and then their mother and then their mother. Every single woman on Earth gets to that person. That doesn't mean they don't have other female ancestors. It just means that those other female ancestors that weren't mitochondrial Eve, that were existing at the same time as she, didn't result in their ancestry through purely the female line. Yeah. And a similar thing happens with Y chromosome Adam. So if you go to your father and his father and his father and his father, and you do this for all the males on the planet, you get to Y chromosomal Adam through only male descent.
Like I said, usually the males ostensibly combine earlier than the female ones, most of the time.
I don't know. That might be a possibility.
Perhaps. Go ahead. Sorry.
But yeah, another joke I made up one time. If the monkey thing, if you're listening for monkeys and stuff.
I'm not sure I know this joke.
Oh, the creationists say if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys?
Oh, right.
Well, Martian thing. Creationists on Mars would be like, if we came from Earthlings, how come there's still Earthlings?
Yeah, it's the same argument. It's a ridiculous one.
They actually do that if there's a creationists on Mars in 1,000 million years.
Well, I mean,
if Americans came from British, then why are they still British?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing. Like we have an example here. So, the white population of the United States and Canada came from Europe. Well, we also have a European in the room. How did he get here if Europeans turned into Americans? Like, well, they didn't all go to America.
I shouldn't exist.
Yeah, apparently Nestle, you prove creationism.
Creationists on Mars saying that in 1,000 years. If we came from Earthlings, how come they're still Earthlings?
Right. Yeah. And to be fair, a lot of the more sophisticated, quote unquote, sophisticated creationists don't use that. Like, you're not going to catch like Ken Ham,
no.
Or anyone from like the Discovery Institute saying that old chestnut. They know better than that.
Think it's died out by now, or is it still going on?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your sentence.
I think that old thing is died out by now.
No, it hasn't. Like, people still say it, but they tend to be sort of the less well-read creationists, not the ones who run the big organizations. Because while creationism is almost entirely inward-facing, they don't engage with the scientific community really at all.
Standing for truth, right? I haven't heard him say that exact argument, but he has some really stupid shit. I mentioned in one of your hangouts that he believes Kenneth Hovind's claim about the trilobite,
Oh, that they're still. Oh, that they're.
Yeah.
Man, Vandalia, do you know about Kent Hovind's thing about there might still be trilobites hanging out in the ocean?
Yeah.
I think I might have heard of it, but I really don't pay attention to much what Kent says all the time.
I mean, you probably shouldn't. It's probably better for your health that you don't pay attention to it. So he likes to go on about how there might still be living trilobites, and his evidence for this is the existence of giant isopods. The problem being that isopods are, I mean, they're about as unrelated to trilobites as you can get while still being an arthropod.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, it's basically like saying, oh, there might still be.
It's like calling a horseshoe crab a crab.
Yeah, it's exactly the same amount of distance. Like if we go with more familiar animals, it might be like saying, basically mixing up a horse and a frog. There's just so little commonality between a trilobite and an isopod, and yet he's just like, oh well, they're both bottom-dwelling segmented organisms. Maybe they're the same thing. Like, no, there's just so much wrong with it. In fact, horseshoe crabs are much more closely related to trilobites than they are.
When you ask him, what exactly is a trilobite, and he says, well, I have to do some research on that one.
Well, yeah, because he doesn't know what anything is really.
Speaking of arthropods and insects like that, stupid things. They beat us both the land and the air. They beat us the land and they beat us the air.
Yeah. Well, the arthropod body plan is extremely adaptable.
Yeah. Evolvability extremely high.
Yeah. And so it's really not surprising that they would be the first animals to really make it big on land, as well as the first ones to get flight.
Yeah, we had to use pterosaurs, the dinosaurs, and bats. We had to use we had to modify our arms to be wings. They got special.
So it's actually even not clear what parts of the insect became the wing. That's actually one of the bigger mysteries in evolution right now is what is an insect wing? Because if you look at insects that are basal enough to not have wings, you get things like silverfish. They don't have anything that looks like it would be homologous to an insect wing. So it's still a really big question. Where did insect wings come from? And there are a bunch of competing hypotheses, but all of them have some really big problems with them. So I don't know. If you're into entomology or just evolution in general, I would say look into where do insect wings come from, because it's really
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting and very mysterious. And arthropods do rule the world to some extent.
Yeah, of course, the trilobite claim of Kent Hovind is like.
Oh my god!
Bullshit. But I actually wish that trilobites are still alive, because we could learn so much about them if they are still alive, and it wouldn't disprove evolution even if they still are around.
Right. I mean, they almost certainly aren't, but it would be really cool.
A lot of them died in the big Permian extinction.
Yeah.
Yes.
Trilobites are an index. Trilobites as a group can be used as an index fossil for the Paleozoic.
They were declining in diversity even before then, and there was only one family left in the Permian, but then they met their end at the end of the Permian.
Yeah, they actually went through a few periods of decline in biodiversity a few times, but it was the end Permian that really killed them off. But I don't know exactly why. Were they restricted to one niche or something in the Permian or something? I don't know. It's not entirely clear. One thing is that if the formation of the Siberian traps really are the thing that caused the end Permian extinction, which seems fairly likely that was the big contributing factor.
Yeah.
One of the things that kind of eruption would do is it would significantly acidify the ocean. And trilobite shells are made of calcium carbonate. It's the same stuff that clam shells are made of. Yeah. And so it would become... Also
the eyes are rock, basically. That's also weird. Yeah.
So it's entirely possible that the big problem was that trilobites just in that chemical environment simply couldn't actually deposit the chemical makeup of their shells into their carapace. And so without a hard carapace...
Yeah, also no sponges. There were no coral... maybe sponges, but there were no coral reefs for millions of years. Only new coral reefs were formed after the Cretaceous, I think.
And it's for similar reasons, because... basically, when the ocean is sufficiently acidic, you can't lay down shells. You can't form shells. And so coral coral are basically jellyfish that never become free swimming. Because, a jellyfish, when they reproduce, they produce a polyp, which is a little stalk with some tentacles at the top. And then new jellyfish will kind of just bud off of the top of the stalk. And so each polyp will form a few of those. Well, a coral is basically just a jellyfish polyp that never produces jellyfish. But they also have evolved to lay down this casing of calcium. But when the ocean is sufficiently acidic, they can't do that. And so they just are forced to survive as just a polyp, which is possible. Polyps can survive as cesspool filter feeders. I mean, and that's basically what an anemone is. An anemone is basically a coral that doesn't make a shell.
But shelled cephalopods survive the permanent mass extinction, right? Like the nautilus and the ammonites and such.
Yeah, and it's not clear why. It could just be that they found some non-acidic area. So one of the things about mass extinction is there are always some pockets that don't really feel the full effect of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so it could just be that they managed to hide some place where that was effective.
Yeah.
It could also
maybe they were like pelagic, like free swimming, and the trilobites were more like at the bottom feeders, like that. Yeah.
Although it's not clear how bivalves made it through.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Things and that. I've been trying to find out more information about the lesser extinctions. You hear about the big five, but you really don't advertise the little ones that much.
Yeah. Everyone knows the big meteor impact, but almost nobody knows about like the Devonian extinction or the Ordovician extinction and the Permian extinction.
Yeah, those are I knew about those now. I learned about the Triassic extinction, but I recently learned about the carbon Permian one, or the rainforest.
The rainforest. I don't think it's one of the big five. I think, right? It's one of the minor extinctions.
I think it's one of the smaller ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
that one wiped out most of the amphibians, paraphyletic group, and
amphibians, and that's why we don't have the giant dragonflies anymore.
Also, yeah.
It's why we don't have griffin flies, although a smaller griffin fly I think would survive just fine today.
Also, one nitpick: the giant dragonfly isn't actually a dragonfly. Like if you look it up, it belongs to a different order of insects.
Yeah, that's why I went with griffin fly. That's the common name that they're known by, at least in English. I don't know what the common name is in other languages.
Even though I don't mention it, I think probably the first mass extinction was probably the oxygen one I know of. I don't know if mass extinction or not, but a lot of things were.
The oxygen catastrophe. Yeah. Like.
Yeah, that radically changed the face of the biosphere because before that, almost everything is anaerobic.
Yeah. Although I don't know if you know him. Like, do you know how do you call Nick Lane? Like he wrote a book called the Vital Question, and then it talks about like the origins of life and the origins of eukaryotes, which is also a big mystery. And he mentioned the oxygen catastrophe, and he says there is actually no evidence that it occurs. Like we sort of infer it because, of course, oxygen is dangerous to anaerobic life, and before oxygen there was mostly anaerobic life, so there must have been an extinction event. But he says basically the bacteria could have survived still in pockets where there is no oxygen. So,
which they still do. I mean, there's still lots of anaerobic bacteria. In fact, if you ever hear someone getting Botox injections or dying of botulism, the botulin bacterium is an anaerobic bacterium.
Yeah, and TJ makes a good point too. The dinosaur thing. The beginning of Triassic was an extinction event, and then Jurassic was one, and then skipped the one to the KT boundary one. But no one ever talks about the Jurassic Cretaceous things, because something died there too.
Well, I think the reason that these lesser known extinction events don't get as much press is because they weren't nearly as radical a change up to the scape of the landscape of what life was around. Yeah. So which major animals didn't make it? Like which major groups of animals that people can name didn't make it from the Jurassic into the Cretaceous?
Like if you look at America, like first there were Carcharodontosaurs, I think. Then they were replaced by Tyrannosaurs, and both are still big theropods, so not really much not really much changed.
Speaking of that, are you Jurassic or Cretaceous?
Jurassic.
So you didn't make it the Cretaceous one.
Yeah, Tyrannosaurus is most well known from the Morrison Formation of sort of like Midwest North America.
Mhm.
Yeah, although there are some Tyrannosaurus specimens from Europe too. So Tyrannosaurus is sometimes thought of as a particularly American dinosaur, but that's not really true. It's certainly. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Is this also your actual favorite dinosaur species? Tyrannosaurus?
No. My favorite dinosaur species is Meleagris gallopavo. Yeah, the turkey.
My favorite is, and it's I hate it actually. It's so basic, but my favorite is T-Rex. It's just,
hey, you know what? There's absolutely nothing wrong with T-Rex. T-Rex
so basic.
I get the reason that T-Rex is such a popular dinosaur because T-Rex is just awesome.
My favorite used to be my favorite was Allosaur.
Allosaurus, yeah, Allosaurus is pretty cool.
The T-Rex with the arm.
And T Lane says Meganura is the proper name. So Meganura is a genus name, but there is a wider group of animals whose scientific classification I do not remember, but they're very closely related to dragonflies. And Meganura was a member of that group, and I do not remember its official scientific name.
And it's also interesting to note, the quoted dragonfly type, like the two-winged, and they are like one of the earliest offshoots of the insect clade. So they retain like the very primitive, or I should actually say basal traits. Like they have two wings and they cannot fold. And later insects evolve the ability to fold their wings.
Mm-hmm.
So now they have four wings and they can fold. But then later insects evolve like the beetles. They modified their front wings into covers basically.
Mm-hmm.
And some insects like the flies and mosquitoes, they modified their hind wings into these halters, that they are called, and that is how like they are sensors.
Yeah, they're basically for balance.
Yeah, for balance, and that's why it's so hard to catch a fly, because they use these stocks to like really be really agile and know their orientation during flight.
Yeah. Yep.
Speaking of different errors and stuff, I learned about these things. It's not really until you get past to the crisis we start breaking down even more errors. Like the periods and
so. One of the rules of thumb is that the closer you get to being to humans, whether temporally or morphologically, the finer a distinction humans like to make. Yeah. So that's why you can get creationists getting away with saying that frogs are a kind, but that you won't catch one of them saying that, oh well, parasodactyls are a kind. Why? There's way more diversity within frogs than there is within odd-toed ungulates.
You know Ray Comfort, he calls bacteria a kind.
Right, yeah, which is absolute. Like, if a bacteria can be a single kind, then humans can be in the same kind as an amoeba.
As a fungus, yeah.
Or a pine tree, to go with the
pine tree and elephant, the same kind. Yes.
Right, yeah, according to Ray Comfort's apparent definition for kind. But as far as the length of geological periods, one of the reasons why they get shorter as you get closer to the present, as a general rule of thumb, is that these ages were primarily identified by people based essentially on counting strata. And so you have more surviving strata as you get younger and younger, just because there have been fewer subsequent erosion events. And so if you look at a column of sediment, on average, newer formations are going to be a bit thicker and more likely to appear. And so it's easier to identify different ages within the newest strata than it is within the older ones. Also, there is just that fact that there's this bias that humans have towards making finer grade distinctions the closer something is to them.
Yeah, I recently heard the term, I forget what's the period it was in. It was like the Mississippian and the Pennsylvania periods? I forget what's
So those aren't periods. Those are stages.
Formations. Formations? No.
Well, they're not quite formations. They are stages in. So each period. So you have epochs, right?
Yeah.
So like so epochs are the biggest thing. You have like the Archean epoch, the Proterozoic epoch.
I think they are not called eons, I think, right?
Yeah, maybe it is. Yeah, there's a lot of names. So what most people know are the periods, right? You know, the Jurassic period, the Cretaceous period. Those are grouped into eras. So the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, and the Triassic are all in the Mesozoic era. You know, the Devonian, the Silurian, the Cambrian. Those are all in the why can't I think of it? The Paleozoic era. Then everything after the Cretaceous is in the that has a few different names, but Neogene is one of the things. It doesn't matter. But each period itself is broken down into stages. So there's a Pennsylvanian stage, and stages are smaller than periods. And even within a stage, it's usually not a universal thing, but you'll get local subdivisions. So within the Pennsylvanian stage of, say, North America, usually there are subgroupings in there to represent different environments in North America. And then you'll get different groups within the stages if you go to, say, that same stage in Europe or Africa or Australia.
It's eon. Like you have the Phanerozoic eon, and you have the Cenozoic era. The era,
yeah. Okay.
One nitpick. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, there are so many different terms for these different kinds of things.
But I forget. Was that the Permian or the Carboniferous, the Mississippian and the Pennsylvania?
I think Mississippian is in the Carboniferous, right, or not?
I would honestly have to look it up again.
Yeah. Mississippian is in the Carboniferous, and the Pennsylvanian also.
Yeah, that's the one thing we gotta do here. We gotta actually look things up and study things instead of assuming things.
Right. Yeah. Like instead of just going with whatever comes up first. Like I would look at a chart.
Just say that's what my Bible book says. This, so it gotta be true.
Yeah. Also, somebody in the live chat says that one creation is called "All Snakes Are Kind," and I think they have to do that because, of course, they talk about the big evil snake who convinced Eve to bite the apple, and it transformed into like a legless snake.
Hey, I think of snakes and lizards. Do we know snakes are lizards? Do we know which lizard the snakes are most closely related to, or is it?
Yes.
Yes. I think there's also a big debate about that. Like snakes were either descended from burrowers or they were descended from like swimmers.
Yes. So it's not clear exactly what the impetus was for losing legs in the first place, but we do know which modern lizards they're most closely related to.
All right.
And that is varanids, like Australian goannas or water monitors or Komodo dragons. Those are all the varanid lizards. And one way you can tell if they're closely related is if you look at varanid, they have a forked tongue that they stick out like a snake does, and then they bring it back to a special scent organ that is at the roof of their mouth. And that's the exact same thing that snakes do. And also varanids, they either have vestigial poison glands, or in some cases they actually have functional poison glands that secretes poison down a groove on the tooth. And the groove isn't entirely enclosed like a snake fang is, but it's still there. And then the next closest group of lizards that are the sister group to varanids and snakes are the group where you get the Mexican beaded lizard and the Gila monster, which are, again, venomous snakes, or lizards, sorry.
Venomous lizard, yeah.
And then the mosasaurs are in that family. So
it's not clear if mosasaurs are closer to varanids or snakes, but they are within that group. They either branch from monitor lizards or from snakes.
Yeah, and I also think like mosasaurs are also fairly closely related to like snakes and varanids.
Yeah, they are. They're within that. The common ancestor of varanids and snakes was also almost certainly an ancestor of mosasaurs.
Okay, can you imagine mosasaurs actually being venomous also? Like
they may well have been.
Holy shit!
It's entirely possible.
If they weren't OP enough.
Right, yeah, they're gigantic, horrible sea monster lizards. Yeah. They may well have been venomous. But then, interestingly, once you get out, if you want to say, well, what's the sister group to the like the Mexican bee lizards and the varanids and the snakes, and I guess the mosasaurs, you get to iguanas.
Mhm.
Yeah, so iguanas, snakes, varanids, those venomous sort of North American, like Southwest North America lizards, they are all in a clade that's fairly well established. It's not 100% there yet, but the clade is called Toxicophora.
Yeah.
And then eventually we get to what the
It's mostly supported by genetics, and I think like the morphological camp of like squamate systematics more points to another clade called Sclerosla. I can't pronounce it entirely. Like it's another different clade. Like
Yeah.
you have to look it up. Yeah.
As a rule, I am much more inclined to trust genetics than morphology.
Me also. Like I'm more leaning towards genetics. Yeah.
because
And sorry.
it's like, is there a difference between clades and phylology, or the same thing?
So cladistics and phylogenetics, there's a lot of overlap, but phylogenetics is specifically looking at the genetics of organisms.
Yeah.
And they use a lot of very
Cladistics,
similar
yeah.
techniques.
Like,
Cladistics,
cladistics takes all data, like morphological or genetics.
yeah. And as a rule, though, when there's a conflict between the morphological reconstruction for a family tree and the genetics has a tendency to win out unless there's some extreme reason to suspect that it's not the case.
Like with maybe like with fossils where we don't have the genetics yet.
Yeah. Oh, and Taco says I want a pet mosasaur. So here's my recommendation: get a varanid as a pet that likes to swim. There's a whole bunch of different species, many of which are of a size that is reasonable for you to keep in a house. But do be careful if you get a varanid as a pet. They can leave a pretty big bite if you're not careful. And while they are very intelligent for a lizard, that for a lizard is in there for a very good reason, because the most intelligent lizards are significantly dumber than any dog or cat you're going to own.
Yeah.
So.
Also, Debbie, like you mentioned about the forked tongue and the connection between the snakes and varanids. But like according to the Toxicophora clade, the forked tongue is not really a monophyletic group.
It may or may not be. Although, so the fork itself probably is something that's a convergent trait, because it really is just a separation, because the tongue is already divided down the middle, and all you have to do to have a forked tongue is just get rid of the tissue that physically forces the two sides together. Mm-hmm. But as far as I know, I think it's called a Jacob's organ. I might be misremembering that though, but it's the actual chemoreceptor at the roof of the mouth. That I believe is actually the a shared derived trait, is having that that scent receptor in the on the roof of the mouth that is actually being used by the tongue, because you can also get scent information from a non-forked tongue. It's just that the fork allows for a greater amount of directional information. So if the scent is stronger on the right side of the tongue, you know to turn right.
Yeah.
So it's very well much more likely that the fork is actually the convergent trait, but that organ itself is probably ancestral. Although interestingly, a lot of paleo artists reconstruct mosasaurs with forked tongues.
Oh yeah. So is it known whether mosasaurs are closer to varanids or closer to lizards, or maybe like sister to both or something? I don't know.
It's not entirely clear. One of the problems is that a mosasaur skull, especially a basal mosasaur skull, looks almost exactly like a varanid skull, but that's also what you would expect for a snake, very basal snake. So you're looking at this and you're like, well, it looks like a basal varanid. It's like, well, okay, but so would a basal snake. So
and it's also like it's also interesting to note that like many of the snakes and varanids, they also swim a lot. Like they tend to swim. Like and also varanids also have like they are almost like endothermic. Well, maybe not like actual endothermic, but they can have like a very high metabolic rate. Mm-hmm. The varanids.
Yeah. And actually, one interesting thing is when you look at a varanid swim and you look at a snake swim, they swim in essentially the same way. Oh, yeah. They both have an anguilliform swimming motion. They don't tend to use their limbs. Mm-hmm. And so anguilliform is where you basically have the whole body kind of undulate. The head moves, and usually the undulations get more pronounced posteriorly. But you have that whole body undulation that happens with both sea snakes, snakes that are terrestrial but that do swim frequently, like anacondas, and also varanids, many of whom swim quite frequently. That's why
even some iguanas, like they are also toxicoferents, although a bit more distantly. They also some of them also swim, like the black marine iguana that Darwin also described in his voyage.
Yeah.
Speaking of different families, this is more of an opinion. These are different opinion things here. Where do you, scientists or you, lie on the whole new division of dinosaur thing?
Oh yeah,
Ornithoscelida. So I am. The consensus has certainly not shifted to Ornithoscelida.
No. Yeah.
It also hasn't completely disregarded Ornithoscelida. So for those people who might not know, there was a paper, what was it, 2 years ago?
I think it's 2017, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I guess maybe...
Bare at all.
2.5, 3 years ago, maybe?
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly what month it was or anything like that.
I think some late summer, I think, if I remember it correctly.
So we'll say 2.5 just to roughly estimate. There was a paper released where a new morphological cladogram was developed for Dinosauria, in which Herrerasaurus was taken out of Theropoda and put into a clade with sauropods. And then Theropoda was actually united with Ornithischia, which are the animals like Stegosaurus or Triceratops. And those were actually put together in a clade that was then called Ornithoscelida. Although I don't know why they named a new clade, because that clade has an identical definition to Dinosauria. So really what they found was that sauropods and Herrerasaurus weren't dinosaurs. But that's a minor complaint I have about the paper.
Although I think they did it because people would get upset that sauropods are no longer dinosaurs.
I mean, but every definition I've ever heard for dinosaurs...
Like people get upset about Pluto not being a planet anymore. So how would they react if sauropods are not dinosaurs anymore?
I know. But the thing is that once a clade is defined, that's the definition. That's why Phytosaurs can't be Archosaurs anymore. Because Archosauria is generally defined as the common ancestor of basically the Nile crocodile, and I think it's the pigeon and all of its descendants.
Or the duck.
Might be the duck.
Yeah. Actually, they call crocodile, so I was never seen crocodile.
Well, actually, one common definition for dinosaur is the common ancestor of Triceratops and the pigeon. Mm-hmm. And all of its descendants. So birds are actually now a fairly common thing that's used in definitions for archosaur cladistics. But if you define, so the definitions I've heard for dinosaur are, you always have two animals and their closest, or two organisms and their common ancestor and all descendants. The animals that I've seen picked are Iguanodon and Megalosaurus. I've seen Passer, which is the pigeon, and Triceratops. And I've seen Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus. But if Ornithoscelida is correct, then all of those exclude sauropods. Sauropods wouldn't be dinosaurs. But the thing is that subsequent attempts to reconstruct a similar tree have met with mixed results, depending on which characters are used and exactly how the matrix comparing them is constructed. Also, there has been some question as to whether or not the specimens that were used to conclude trait states for some of the animals in the analysis were sufficient to actually make a conclusive determination of the trait state for that taxon. So there are some problems with the paper. It's not a bad paper. It doesn't. It's not. None of the problems are fatal for it. However, they bring it into enough question to say that there really isn't sufficient evidence to adopt this new family tree.
Let's think about science. It's ever evolving. It's never.
Well, yeah, and it's. Like I said, there isn't enough to completely reject the hypothesis either. It's still a valid hypothesis.
Yeah,
it's just currently, I think, more weakly supported than the traditional view.
There's one good video by Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong. I don't know if you know about that. Like it goes over the paper like really, really well. Like it notes that they used two different traits, even though they actually could be considered the same trait. So they actually weighed the same trait twice sometimes. for example. Like such details are like what makes the paper problematic, but it's still an interesting hypothesis.
Right.
But of course, the creationists might say like, oh, if you cannot tell whether Triceratops is more closely related to a T-Rex than it is to like, then the T-Rex is to like the sauropods, and it's all arbitrary. But of course, you have to bear in mind that the earliest dinosaurs, like the earliest theropod, looked a whole lot like the earliest Ornithischian and also the earliest sauropod.
And then you get Chileosaurus.
Yeah.
What's Chileosaurus? I don't know.
Like how some birds relate. The birds relate to some dinosaurs. Birds are closely related to some dinosaurs, and those dinosaurs are related to other dinosaurs.
Yeah. Also, yeah.
Yeah. Like birds are much more closely related to, say, T-Rex than T-Rex is to Triceratops, or even Ceratosaurus.
Mm-hmm.
Like Ceratosaurus is much more distantly related to T-Rex than T-Rex is to a bird.
Yeah. People consider, like creationists consider like Archaeopteryx to be a true bird, like a fully completed bird. But if you like define bird any more broader than Archaeopteryx is a bird, then Velociraptor would be a bird, because Archaeopteryx is so far away from the birds that you know, such that Velociraptor might be an actual bird if you just broaden the definition more.
AIG has taken to identifying Microraptor as a bird, and Microraptor isn't just in the same family as Velociraptor; it's in the same subfamily.
Yeah,
they're both Velaptus. I can't talk. Velociraptorine dromaeosaurs. Yeah. So if Microraptor is a bird, then guess what? So is Velociraptor.
Yeah.
I think the other big thing I learned recently is, I don't know if it's true how people with that was that as if the three domains of life, there's only two domains of life, and we're not sister clade of archaea, that we might actually be archaeas inside archaeas.
So it's hard to say, really.
I actually hold to the like the ring of life model. Like it says that like when eukaryotes formed, they are basically like a mix between bacteria and archaea. So it's not like eukarya as a whole descended from one or the other. Like it's a mix between the two. Yeah, like we got our like a lot of genes from archaea. We got also a lot of genes from bacteria via our mitochondria, basically. Yeah,
with the
what's it called, the horizontal and endosymbiosis, and also a lot of horizontal gene transfer, but also mainly endosymbiosis.
Yeah, those two things make it much more complicated. They're very basic.
You get down there. But I think the two main things, either the TTwC tree or the ECOC tree, I can't pronounce them.
The Luca. Oh.
Not Luca. No, it starts with a W. Like TTwC had the three domain one, and the ECOC one was the two domain one.
Well, even under most three domain models, archaea tends to cluster closer to eukaryota than it does to the rest of
we're more sister to archaea, but the other one is we're within the archaea one somewhere.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of those things where we're at a point where there's so much transfer of genetic material and so much endosymbiosis going on that you can't really form that nice little branching tree at the very base.
Yeah,
like cladistics doesn't really work with bacteria much. Maybe some groups, like you have like the proteo bacteria and the gamma.
They probably speciate a lot faster than more.
Well, the thing is, what's a species for a bacterium?
Yeah, it doesn't. There is actually no species in bacteria. It doesn't really exist, actually. So,
humans give them like arbitrary definitions, like let's say you have E. coli. Like they have some morphological characteristics that are common to a whole bunch of very closely related bacteria, and if a bacterium is within this genetic group and it has these morphological characteristics, then humans just call them Escherichia coli.
Yeah.
Why?
Sorry.
Why? Because humans like to name things and put them in boxes. That's why.
This is one of the things that also Nick Lane also talked about in his book, The Vital Question, about the origins of eukaryotes. Like he says that like the reason why eukaryotes have sex and have also like sometimes 2 sexes, and then only 2 at maximum. Like there are some who have no sexes, of course. Actually, quite a lot of eukaryotes don't have sexes, but they have only at maximum 2 sexes, and they. And the reason for that is because they have mitochondria, basically. It's all about mitochondria, because one divides mitochondria and the other doesn't. And the reason for that is really technical, but the reason for that is because something about the mutations, like you need to have only one source, otherwise something weird happens. And it doesn't really work, apparently.
Cool. Well, what's it like that?
Well, sorry.
What was I say? We've wrapped this up. I was going to say, it must like the talk forever. Probably should start wrapping this up soon. It's been 2.5 hours.
Oh.
Yeah, that's true. I do want to point out one quick thing, though, which is that there is a major group of eukaryotes that has a tendency to have more than 2 sexes. And that is...
I think you mean mating types, yeah.
Well, so the difference between a mating type and a sex basically comes down to, are the gametes physically distinguishable? And it's true that in mating... Sorry, I just dropped something. That in mating types for fungi, the gametes tend to be physically identical.
Yeah.
However, because they are chemically distinct and you need fungi of different mating types in order to produce viable new offspring, I would say that you're splitting hairs between the difference between a mating type and a sex. A sex is basically just a kind of mating type.
No.
Look, you need different sexes to breed. You need different mating types to breed.
Yeah.
And the differentiation between sexes also includes chemical differences. Like sperm isn't just a tiny ovum. There are chemical differences between spermatozoa and ova. So, but I do think it's interesting that fungi have a tendency to have a multiplicity of mating types, which functionally there's really not a big difference between a sex and a mating type.
I know.
Sexes are a special type of mating type.
Right. Exactly.
I wonder it would have if they might have it. I'm not sure, but if plants and fungi had sexual selection.
Sexual selection seems to be pretty strongly correlated with an ability to choose sexual partners. Yeah. And since neither plants nor fungi have the ability to choose sexual partners, it's probably not a factor.
It may be true with orchids. Like you have like an orchid that really looks like a bee, and it's basically not a bee, but like that types of orchids that attract insects by basically mimicking a mate. Like they think, oh, it's a mate, I can mate with it, but it's just a plant, basically. That was genetic. Like back in the wind days, like the wind pollen, like, oh, I don't like that flower looks ugly. I'm not going to land on that flower. Yeah, it's like basically a blow up sex doll for the insects.
So. Yeah, if we're gonna wrap up, I guess I don't have a huge amount of stuff that I have to announce or anything. Tuesday is another Kent with Bent. It's Kent with Bent 19. I believe we're calling it Requiem for a Hovind, which is and the thumbnail is going to be based on the Requiem for a Dream poster. Well, one of the movie posters. Then there's going to be a scripted video coming out Thursday, probably another scripted video coming out Saturday, unless I have on Leaving Young Earth Creationism, which currently I don't have anyone lined up for. And then, of course, the Tuesday after will be yet another Kent with Bent.
Hey, any volunteers want to be on the chat right now? Want to be on his show?
Yeah, if you're a former Young Earth Creationist and you're watching this, my email is the.depper.dino.yt for YouTube at gmail.com. You can also find that email on my About page. So it's hidden under the, this email is for business purposes only, but contacting me to be on Leaving Young Earth Creationism is a business reason to contact me. So, and Benthoven volunteers to be on Kent with Bent. Well, thank you, Benthoven.
Yeah, hey,
volunteer for the tribute.
Yeah, hey, I'm free Tuesday if you need me a drink with Kent with Bent too, sometime in the future.
All right. I don't know. We try not to have guests on all the time because there's often a bit of crowding when we get 3 or more people. So I'm not sure, like
whenever you have an opening.
Right. Next time that we're open for a guest, I will definitely make sure that you are in the mix for our choices.
Sweet.
We've had Erica on before. We've had Cheshire Vic on before. Who else? Have we had anyone else?
Was Eric on?
I know Eric was on a series of live streams that I did about, but it wasn't Kent with Bent. It was will Kent get asked to ask in that one? I don't know, Taco. I kind of hope not, because I don't really want to see that, but you never know.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll definitely keep you in mind as
cool.
someone to have on as a guest. But like I said, we try not to have guests too often.
So
one of the things one of the last things I want to mention was like I also mentioned in the live chat, like Kent Hovind once called a Zeuglodon or a Basilosaurus a mosasaur and a dinosaur.
Yeah,
but mosasaurs are not dinosaurs, as we have established. They are lizards, and Basilosaurus is neither a mosasaur nor a dinosaur. It's a mammal. So Kent is fractally wrong on that.
Yeah, it's amazing how badly wrong he can get certain things, and that's why I like Kent with Bent, because I get to hang out and just drink and make fun of Kent Hovind because he's just laughably bad at his job.
So when is your next dinosaur episode?
Things that aren't dinosaurs. Right now, I'm not sure when it will be scheduled. I just got really done with the planning stages. I'm going to be writing a script. Probably this week, or next week, I guess, because it's Saturday.
Have you done like the pseudosuchians, or have you not done that?
So my crocodilians episode covered a lot of pseudosuchia.
All right.
So I took it as an opportunity to kind of branch into pseudosuchians in general. So we did I talked about Thalattosuchians, Rausuchians, Sphenosuchians.
Sauropterygians.
I did Sauropterygians. I included them with plesiosaurs, basically, because plesiosaurs are really the only well-known Sauropterygians. Like, no one knows what a placodont is.
I do.
Well, okay, fair enough. You do, but you are not most people. So yeah, I did go into, though, that there are in my plesiosaur episode, I went into the fact that there are in the Triassic there were other non-plesiosaur Sauropterygians. So I might go more specifically into groups of Sauropterygians, but at first I'm going to cover a lot of the bigger groups. So like when I do Dimetrodon, I'm also going to cover other Pelycosaur grade synapsids.
And then Dicynodonts, or how do you call it again?
Well, there's Cynodonts and Dicynodonts.
Yeah,
so those aren't the same group.
Yeah. I also meant Dicynodonts, like the tusk beak.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I might do Dicynodonts someday.
Yeah. So Ness, you have anything? You have videos that you make, or you want to advertise anything?
Oh, I have a channel, but I don't do a whole lot on that. I made one video on nuclear energy. Like I don't know about Aaron Ra, right? So I'm a big fan of this, and I saw one hangout he had, and I just had a question like, oh, what do you think about nuclear power? And he said, well, I'm pretty much against it. He says, but then the guest of that thing hangout says, well, maybe you can make a video about that and show Aaron where he is wrong about, and so I made that video on my channel.
If you're against nuclear power, chances are you're seriously wrong about nuclear power. I have worked in the nuclear power industry. That's what I did in the Navy. And it is by far the safest and cleanest form of energy. And I'm not even just it's not technically renewable, but it is much safer and much cleaner than wind or solar or hydro.
Well, but with a bit of ingenuity, it can be renewable, because you could potentially extract like uranium and even thorium from the ocean. And it is basically practically infinite, and it gets even renewed because, of course, the ocean floor is turned over by the plate tectonics, and that releases the uranium.
I would say that the time scale on which nuclear energy would continue to have harvestable raw resources is similar to like the lifetime of the planet. Yeah. So while you can say, well, is it technically renewable? Well, I mean, in the most technical sense, maybe not, but there's enough new fissionable material on Earth that we could probably go the entire, a realistic habitable span of Earth as a planet and still really be able to have fissionable material that we can use.
And I think we should not put so much emphasis on renewable, because like biomass is renewable technically, but it's really polluting.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, even like solar is associated with a lot of pollution. Just mining the materials is polluting, and solar panel waste is terrible for the environment. It's absolutely atrocious. And wind towers disrupt bird migrations. There's a lot of disruption from wind. Even hydroelectric causes disruptions to the the ecosystem around the river and the fish and all that. So when I says, all right, so think of the worst nuclear disaster and think of the worst renewable power disaster. Which one is worse? Well, of course, the nuclear. Well, no, the worst disaster is the Ben Kayo Dam. When the Chinese Ben Kayo Dam broke, it killed more people than Chernobyl even. So it's actually, of course nobody knows about that, but everyone knows about Chernobyl. Well, the funny thing about Chernobyl is that most of the people who died trying to do things that were essentially impossible, like cool off the reactor.
Yeah.
If everyone had just left, no one would really. Only very few people would have died. The Chernobyl incident could have had a death toll in the dozens if people had just run away.
Yeah, and also take iodine tablets very soon. Of course, they were also late with that, so then you have thyroid cancer. But even then, the death toll might be in the thousands at its highest.
Well, although I don't want to turn this into a second.
Yeah. So sorry about it. Sorry about that.
We can make that. We can do that in a future episode. But as for me, next week I'm taking a break from this. Taking a break from the sciencey stuff, and we're gonna be talking about the Phoenix Wright series games, Justice for All. So if you ever heard of that game and you're interested in the Phoenix Wright series, you might want to come check it out. Other than that, I'm just recording some games and stuff and other random things like food reviews. So you guys have a catchphrase you say at the end of your things?
I just remind people that I'm the dapper dinosaur.
And I say, as always, never stop learning and enjoy the randomness.
In relation to nuclear power